In the year 1137, a child was born in the ancient city of Tikrit, located along the banks of the Tigris River. Little did anyone know that this boy, destined to become one of history's most revered figures, would rise to change the course of the world. His name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub, but the world would come to know him as Saladin, the unifier of the Muslim world and a legendary warrior who reclaimed Jerusalem from the Crusaders. Saladin's story begins in a time of great turmoil. The Seljuk Turks had established their power across the Middle East, but their empire was fragmented. The Crusades were ongoing, with Christian knights from Europe seeking to carve out their kingdoms in the Holy Land. Saladin was born into a Kurdish family with deep roots in the military tradition. His father, Ayyub, was a prominent figure in the region, serving as a military commander for the Zingid dynasty. From an early age, Saladin was surrounded by the world of warriors, strategy, and politics. His family was not wealthy in the traditional sense, but they had a legacy of loyalty and service, particularly to the Muslim rulers of the region. Saladin's father and uncle were key players in the world of military leadership, and young Saladin would grow up listening to their stories, learning the ways of leadership, strategy, and faith. Tikrit, where he was born, was a city of great strategic importance, perched on a crucial trade route. This would serve as the foundation for his understanding of geography and power dynamics, an insight that would later shape his military genius. At the heart of Saladin's upbringing was the connection between faith and military duty. The early education he received focused on Islamic teachings, but his tutors also ensured that he was well-versed in history, literature, and the military arts. This blend of spiritual depth and practical knowledge formed the backbone of his character, as he would come to embody both the wisdom of a scholar and the courage of a warrior. As Saladin grew older, his education became the cornerstone of his future. Raised in a family with strong military roots, it was clear that he was destined for something extraordinary. But what set him apart, even in his early years, was his insatiable curiosity and his capacity to absorb the lessons around him. The early years of Saladin's life were spent not just in the classroom, but in the company of some of the most influential figures of the time. His father, Ayyub, was a respected commander, known for his loyalty to his superiors and his keen military insight. But it was his uncle, Shirkuh, who would become one of the most significant influences on the young Saladin. Shirkuh was not only a seasoned general, but a man of immense ambition and vision. He played a vital role in the Zingid dynasty's military campaigns, particularly in Syria and Egypt. It was under Shirkuh's mentorship that Saladin began to learn the art of warfare, with lessons ranging from battlefield tactics to the deeper strategies of governance. These early years under Shirkuh's tutelage would shape Saladin's leadership style, emphasizing not just military might, but also diplomacy and respect for both allies and enemies. Alongside his military training, Saladin's education was rooted in the teachings of Islam. His family, devout and committed to the faith, ensured that Saladin received a thorough grounding in the Quran, Islamic law, and the spiritual aspects of leadership. This dual focus on both martial prowess and religious scholarship helped to mold him into a well-rounded individual, a combination of warrior and wise leader. Saladin's education, however, was not confined to traditional studies alone. His keen intellect led him to question, to debate, and to explore the world around him. It was said that Saladin had a natural ability to learn quickly, often outpacing his peers in both religious and military matters. This thirst for knowledge, combined with his disciplined approach, set him apart from many others in his generation. But it was his sense of honor and duty that stood out most. Saladin wasn't just learning for himself. He was learning to serve a higher cause, to unite and lead the Muslim world against external threats, particularly the Crusaders. This strong sense of duty would later define his leadership and guide him through the challenges that lay ahead. As Saladin reached his teenage years, it became clear that his destiny lay far beyond the quiet walls of Tikrit. In 1154, when Saladin was just 17 years old, his uncle, Shirkuh, called upon him to join the military campaigns that were becoming central to the Zingid dynasty's ambitions in the Levant. This marked the beginning of Saladin's real exposure to the complex and often brutal world of politics and warfare. Shirkuh's influence was pivotal in shaping Saladin's early experiences. It was under his uncle's command that Saladin first tasted the harshness of battle, learning firsthand the weight of leadership and the costs of war. Shirkuh, a seasoned general, knew how to balance the art of war with the subtle intricacies of political maneuvering. He wasn't just a warrior. He was a strategist, a diplomat, and a leader of men. Under his guidance, Saladin learned the importance of alliances, bargaining, and how to keep enemies at bay while securing the loyalty of allies. In 1164, when Saladin was still young, his uncle's efforts took them into the heart of Egypt, where Saladin's real education and politics began. It was here that Saladin first came into contact with the turbulent political environment of Egypt, a land at the crossroads of multiple powers, including the Fatimid Caliphate, which had been in decline for years. Shirkuh, appointed by the Zengid ruler Nur ad-Din, was sent to assist the Fatimids in stabilizing their rule. Saladin, ever loyal to his uncle, accompanied him, beginning to understand the delicate dance of military and political maneuvering. This campaign was Saladin's baptism by fire, where he proved his worth as both a commander and strategist. However, despite his success, it was not the military victories that marked Saladin's rise to prominence. It was his capacity for leadership and his ability to connect with both the people he ruled and the warriors he led. Saladin was known for his fairness, his sense of justice, and his ability to inspire loyalty in those around him. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Saladin saw military leadership as more than just leading men into battle. He understood that a true leader must also command respect, maintain moral integrity, and create a sense of unity among his forces. By the end of the 1160s, Saladin had firmly established himself not only as a skilled military leader, but also as a figure capable of navigating the treacherous waters of political alliances, a skill that would serve him well. And by the time Saladin reached his early 30s, his name was beginning to spread beyond the borders of Tikrit in Egypt. He had proven himself in battle, gained experience in politics, and earned the respect of military commanders and statesmen alike. However, it was in 1169, at the age of 32, that Saladin's true ascent to power began, a moment that would alter the course of history. It all started with his uncle, Shirkuh, who had been serving the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt as a general, tasked with defending the weakening empire against Crusader forces. However, Shirkuh's sudden death in 1169 opened up a void in leadership. Saladin, already recognized for his military acumen and loyalty, was chosen to take his uncle's place. But the position of power he was about to inherit was far from simple. The Fatimid Caliphate was in disarray. The caliphs were weak, and their control was slipping. Egypt was caught in the middle of a political struggle, both internally and with external Crusader forces. It was a land of political intrigue, where rival factions vied for control. Yet, Saladin's blend of military brilliance and diplomatic savvy allowed him to secure the loyalty of key military leaders, local commanders, and even parts of the Egyptian civilian population. As soon as he assumed control, Saladin made his move to consolidate power by installing himself as Vizier of Egypt, an incredibly powerful political position. What made this appointment unique was that Saladin, despite his military background, understood that real power did not just come from the battlefield. It came from having the trust of the people, the loyalty of the military, and the ability to navigate the currents of political alliances. In a stunning demonstration of his leadership, Saladin began to dismantle the Fatimid political structure, sidelining those who were not loyal to him. He restored a more orthodox Sunni rule, shifting Egypt's allegiance away from the Shia Fatimids and toward the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. This was a brilliant political maneuver, one that strengthened his position not just in Egypt, but in the wider Muslim world, which was dominated by Sunni Islam. Saladin's vision was not just military conquest. It was to bring stability and unity to a fragmented land. He quickly established himself as a reformer, ensuring that his policies balanced military needs with religious values. This was a turning point for Saladin. He wasn't just a warrior anymore. He was a statesman, a leader capable of uniting a divided Egypt and positioning himself as the future ruler of the Levant. In the years following Saladin's appointment as Vizier of Egypt in 1169, the young leader faced one of his most critical challenges, consolidating his power in a land fraught with political divisions and external threats. Egypt was in a state of flux, and Saladin knew that to ensure his survival and success, he would need to solidify his position both within the region and within the larger Muslim world. One of Saladin's first actions was to secure the loyalty of the Egyptian military. No small task, given the ongoing conflicts with the Crusaders and internal factions vying for control. He quickly recognized that to maintain his authority, he needed to balance military might with political stability. He focused on creating strong alliances with key military leaders, ensuring they saw him as a figure who could restore order and prosperity to Egypt after years of turmoil under the weakened Fatimids. Saladin also understood the importance of religious unity. Egypt was predominantly Shia due to the influence of the Fatimids, but Saladin was a devout Sunni Muslim, and his leadership marked a clear shift in Egypt's religious orientation. His decision to reinstate Sunni orthodoxy and to emphasize the legitimacy of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad was both a political and spiritual move. By aligning Egypt with the Abbasid Caliphate, he gained not only religious legitimacy, but also the support of other Sunni rulers across the Muslim world, who saw his rise as a unifying force against the Crusader threat. At the same time, Saladin's military prowess began to shine as he deftly navigated the challenges posed by the Crusader states along the eastern Mediterranean. One of his first significant military achievements in this period was the defeat of the Crusader forces at the Battle of Montcassard in 1177, where Saladin's forces, though outnumbered, managed to rout the Crusaders. This victory solidified his reputation as a formidable military leader and demonstrated his strategic brilliance, not just as a tactician, but also as a leader of men who could inspire great loyalty even in the face of adversity. Saladin's early victories and his ability to unify Egypt set the stage for the next phase of his career. By 1174, Egypt was firmly under his control, and he began to look outward, towards Syria, Palestine, and the Levant, where the Crusaders had entrenched themselves. With Egypt now secure, Saladin turned his attention to the greater goal that would define his legacy: the unification of the Muslim world and the eventual reclamation of Jerusalem. As he consolidated his power, Saladin was not only laying the foundation for military conquests but also for a vision of Muslim unity. He sought to unify the fractured Muslim lands, establishing a new sense of solidarity among the various factions of the region. His sense of duty, honor, and vision for a unified Muslim front would eventually lead him to confront the Crusaders head-on, a challenge he would face with a combination. In 1169, Saladin stepped into Egypt, a land that was both rich in history and riddled with political turmoil. At the time, Egypt was under the rule of the Fatimid Caliphate, a once mighty dynasty that had now fallen into decline. The Fatimids, who had been Shia Muslims, had lost much of their political and military power. The caliph was little more than a figurehead, and the land was ripe for change. Saladin's arrival in Egypt wasn't just the entrance of another commander. It was the beginning of a dramatic shift in the balance of power in the region. His uncle, Shirkuh, had been appointed by the Zengid ruler Nur ad-Din to assist the Fatimids in their struggles against the Crusader states and to stabilize Egypt. But despite his military successes, Shirkuh's death in 1169 created a vacuum of power, one that Saladin would swiftly move to fill. At just 32 years old, Saladin found himself thrust into the role of vizier, the second most powerful position in Egypt. The decision to place him in this position was not without its challenges. Egypt was in the grip of internal conflict, with various factions vying for control. On one side, there are the Fatimid loyalists, who hoped to maintain the existing Shia rule, and on the other, there are those who believe that the land needed a strong Sunni leader to restore order and legitimacy. But Saladin wasn't just a military leader. He was a diplomat, a strategist, and a man of deep religious conviction. Unlike many of the commanders before him, Saladin understood that ruling Egypt required more than just force. To gain the loyalty of the people and the military, he would have to walk a fine line between consolidating power, navigating political alliances, and, above all, ensuring that Egypt would be strong enough to defend itself from the external threat posed by the Crusaders. As Saladin settled into his new role, he knew that the Fatimid Caliphate, weakened by internal strife and external pressures, would not be able to maintain control of Egypt for long. Instead of merely propping up the decaying Fatimid state, Saladin began making moves to reshape Egypt's future, transitioning it away from the Shia influence and aligning it with the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate. This would be a pivotal moment in his rise to power, a move that would ultimately strengthen his position and prepare him for the monumental challenges that lay ahead. As Saladin settled into his new role as vizier in 1169, his immediate task was not only to secure the loyalty of Egypt's military and political elite, but also to navigate a land caught between competing religious factions. The Fatimid Caliphate, once a beacon of Shia power, was weakening, and Saladin knew that Egypt could no longer remain under the Fatimid banner. In the face of this disarray, he began his political maneuvering with a masterful blend of strategy, diplomacy, and sheer willpower. To begin his consolidation of power, Saladin realized he had to win the support of the military, the backbone of any successful regime. He sought to gain the loyalty of the military leaders in Egypt, ensuring they saw him not just as a political figurehead, but as a man capable of protecting their interests and maintaining order. With his sharp understanding of military tactics, Saladin earned respect from his forces, showcasing his skills not only as a leader, but as someone who could lead by example on the battlefield. But military loyalty alone wasn't enough. Saladin understood that Egypt's future depended on its religious unity, and for this, he needed to heal the rift between the Sunni and Shia factions. Egypt, under the Fatimids, had long been a Shia stronghold, but Saladin, a devout Sunni, was intent on shifting the nation's allegiance toward the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate. This was a dangerous gamble. Aligning Egypt with the Abbasids could alienate a significant portion of the population, particularly the Shia leaders who still held considerable influence in the region. Saladin's strategy, however, was one of gradual change. He didn't force a sudden transformation, but rather subtly began to shift Egypt's religious allegiances. He replaced Shia officials with Sunni loyalists, slowly but surely reorienting Egypt's religious and political landscape. Saladin's strength lay in his ability to walk this fine line, ensuring that those who were loyal to the old regime felt secure while slowly moving toward a Sunni-centered governance. As Saladin continued to consolidate his position, he faced the Crusader threat looming on Egypt's borders. With the Crusaders already entrenched in the Levant, Saladin knew that Egypt's future survival depended on a strong, united front. Yet, while he strengthened his hold on Egypt, he also began preparing for the larger challenge, the unification of the Muslim world under one banner, ready to face the Crusader invasion head-on. Through these early political maneuvers, Saladin demonstrated an essential quality of leadership, the ability to adapt, to balance loyalty, religion, and military strategy. His vision was clear. Egypt was just the beginning. To truly achieve greatness, he would need to unify the broader Muslim world, pushing back the Crusaders and securing a lasting legacy of peace and prosperity. With his political base slowly but surely solidifying, Saladin knew that his next step was to prove himself on the battlefield. In a region where military strength often determined political legitimacy, Saladin understood that he couldn't rely on diplomacy alone to secure his power. The situation was dire. Egypt was under constant threat from the Crusaders in the Levant and from various internal factions. Saladin's reputation was still in the making, and his first military campaigns were crucial in establishing his leadership. One of Saladin's early and most significant campaigns came in 1171, when he led a military campaign into Syria to secure the region against the Crusader threat. The Crusaders had long held territories in the Levant, but Saladin's first major victory was securing Aleppo, a key city in the Syrian heartland. This victory was critical not only because of Aleppo's strategic importance, but also because it demonstrated Saladin's growing influence in the region. However, it wasn't just the conquest that set Saladin apart. It was his method of warfare. Saladin's military style was both ruthless and strategic. He used his intimate knowledge of the terrain, his ability to maneuver swiftly, and his skill at rallying local forces to outflank his enemies. He didn't just rely on conventional tactics. Saladin was known for his ability. Saladin's forces also had a unique sense of unity and purpose. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Saladin was not only concerned with winning battles. He was determined to inspire loyalty in his troops. His leadership was marked by a sense of justice and integrity, which endeared him to his soldiers. This wasn't just a man commanding an army. This was a leader who treated his forces with respect and shared in their struggles, a quality that would become central to his leadership in the years to come. In 1173, Saladin turned his attention toward Damascus, another crucial city in Syria. The city was held by the Zengid dynasty, and Saladin, seeking to expand his influence, laid siege to it. His siege was both militarily effective and psychologically astute. Instead of launching an all-out assault, he used diplomatic overtures, playing on the fears and divisions within the city. Eventually, his persistence paid off when Damascus agreed to submit to his rule, marking another significant victory for Saladin. These early victories, including the conquest of Aleppo and Damascus, helped cement Saladin's position not just as a military leader, but as a figure capable of uniting and organizing disparate factions. They also showcased his ability to navigate the delicate balance of warfare and diplomacy, gaining territory while minimizing unnecessary bloodshed and winning both hearts and minds. By the time of his successes in Syria, Saladin had proven to the world, and more importantly, to his own people, that he was more than capable of leading a unified Muslim front against the growing Crusader presence. These victories weren't just military. They were a statement to the region that Saladin was a force to be reckoned with. As Saladin's victories on the battlefield began to mount, his next task was to solidify these gains through strategic political alliances. In the complex political landscape of the Levant, military power alone was not enough to ensure long-term success. Saladin knew that to achieve his goal of unifying the Muslim world under one banner, he would need not only the strength of his army, but also the support of key local leaders and influential figures across the region. By 1173, with the conquest of Aleppo and Damascus under his belt, Saladin turned his attention to securing the support of the various factions scattered across the Levant. The region was a patchwork of competing dynasties and tribal alliances, with each ruler focusing on their own territories and interests. Saladin, ever the tactician, understood that he needed to build bridges rather than burn them. One of Saladin's first moves was to forge an alliance with the powerful emir of Mosul, Imad al-Din Zengi's successor. This alliance was essential in strengthening his hold over the northern regions of the Levant, where the Crusaders had established strong fortifications. The agreement was a delicate balancing act, as it also allowed Saladin to project his power into regions that would later become key points in his strategic campaigns against the Crusaders. The success of these alliances hinged not just on military prowess, but on Saladin's keen ability to read the political dynamics of the time. He was patient and pragmatic, leveraging both military strength and diplomatic negotiations to his advantage. Saladin's careful diplomacy enabled him to bring more and more regions under his control without having to engage in costly and destructive warfare. He worked hard to avoid alienating potential allies, and this strategic diplomacy became a hallmark of his rise to power. Additionally, Saladin began to establish alliances with the influential Bedouin tribes of the region. These tribes, while not always loyal to central authority, had deep roots in the desert and controlled critical trade routes. By winning their support, Saladin ensured the security of his newly conquered territories and facilitated the flow of resources and reinforcements. The region of Palestine, home to many of the Crusader states, remained a central focus in Saladin's plan for unification. He knew that to secure lasting control over the Levant, he would need to eliminate the Crusader presence, which was steadily expanding. However, instead of attacking head-on, Saladin chose to consolidate his position by first strengthening his base in Damascus and Aleppo and weaving a network of allies that would help him when the time came to take on the Crusaders. Saladin's diplomatic and political skill turned potential threats into allies, and by the end of 1174, he had effectively unified much of the Levant under his leadership. With his growing political network and solid military victories, Saladin was well on his way to securing dominance in the Muslim world and preparing for the decisive battle that would come in the form of the Crusader states. While Saladin's military conquests and political alliances were critical to his rise, it was his internal reforms that truly solidified his position as one of the most influential leaders of the 12th century. Egypt, his base of power, was a country in turmoil, plagued by internal strife, economic instability, and a weakening central authority. The Fatimids had left Egypt fragmented and vulnerable. It was up to Saladin to restore order, unity, and prosperity to the land. Upon assuming the position of vizier, Saladin immediately set to work on reforms that would stabilize Egypt. His first priority was to strengthen the military, the backbone of his power. He reorganized the Egyptian army, ensuring that it was more disciplined, better supplied, and equipped to handle both internal uprisings and external threats. Saladin's military reforms were deeply rooted in his own experiences as a soldier. He believed in creating an army that was not just effective in battle. In addition to military restructuring, Saladin also focused on administrative reforms to ensure that his rule was both just and efficient. He established a system of taxation that was fair and aimed at strengthening the economy. Recognizing that the stability of his regime depended on the prosperity of the people, Saladin ensured that the tax burden did not fall too heavily on the poor, which helped to maintain the loyalty of Egypt's common citizens. Perhaps one of Saladin's most important reforms was his religious policy. Egypt had long been a center of Shia Fatimid rule, but Saladin, a devout Sunni Muslim, worked tirelessly to shift Egypt's allegiance toward the Sunni orthodoxy of the Abbasid Caliphate. This wasn't just about religion, it was about political stability. By reasserting Sunni Islam, Saladin ensured that Egypt aligned with the wider Muslim world, especially the Abbasid Caliphate, which had the backing of many powerful Sunni rulers across the region. This religious shift also helped to unify Egypt's diverse population, bringing together Sunni Arabs, Kurds, and other groups under a common identity. Saladin's commitment to justice and fairness extended to the judicial system as well. He sought to create a legal framework that was rooted in Islamic law, Sharia, ensuring that everyone, regardless of their status, was treated equally under the law. This emphasis on justice won Saladin the respect and loyalty of the people, who saw him not just as a conqueror, but as a ruler who cared for the welfare of his subjects. Beyond Egypt, Saladin's reforms helped to strengthen his reputation across the broader Muslim world. His rule was seen as a restoration of justice and righteousness, and his growing influence led many Muslim leaders from surrounding regions to seek his alliance. His leadership in Egypt became the cornerstone for his future campaigns. It was from this strong base that he would eventually launch his wars to unite the Muslim world and confront the Crusaders. Saladin's ability to blend military strength with political savvy and social reform made him not just a conqueror, but a visionary. By the mid-1170s, he had laid the foundation for a unified Muslim front, setting the stage for the great challenges and triumphs that lay ahead. His reforms not only strengthened Egypt, but also gave Saladin the authority and resources he needed to challenge the Crusader states in the Levant and beyond. By 1174, Saladin's political and military grip on Egypt and the Levant was stronger than ever. His reign was characterized by a blend of strategic diplomacy, internal reforms, and military prowess. But as the years passed, Saladin's vision for the future became clearer. His ultimate goal was not merely to solidify his rule over Egypt, but to unite the Muslim world and challenge the Crusaders who had carved out territories in the Holy Land. Saladin's early successes in Syria and Egypt had set the stage for his next major move, expansion into the Levant. The Crusader states were growing in power, and their hold on cities like Jerusalem, Acre, and Tripoli was a constant source of tension. The Crusaders, having seized key regions in the Holy Land, had been persistent in their efforts to expand, and their presence was an ever-growing threat to the Muslim world. Saladin understood that the time was coming when Egypt's defenses would no longer suffice. He would need to unify the surrounding lands and prepare for a great confrontation. The first step in this vision was to further consolidate his control over the Levant, especially in Syria and Palestine. His political and military dominance in Syria provided him with a strategic advantage, one that allowed him to take a larger view of the entire region. Saladin knew that to take on the Crusaders, he would need a unified front. To achieve this, he began to establish alliances with local Muslim rulers, ensuring that they recognized his authority and pledged allegiance to him. This wasn't just a matter of conquest. It was a diplomatic effort to gather support and strengthen unity among the various Muslim factions, many of whom were divided and often fighting amongst themselves. Saladin's ability to bring people together was one of his greatest strengths. He was not just a conqueror. He was a unifier, able to build bridges between conflicting groups and foster a sense of collective purpose. In addition to political alliances, Saladin also began to organize joint military campaigns, uniting the various Muslim factions against their common enemy, the Crusaders. While his diplomatic efforts were critical, Saladin also continued to build up his military forces. He strengthened the army and prepared for large-scale confrontations. The Crusaders, led by the likes of Richard the Lionheart, were formidable opponents, and Saladin knew that he would have to outmaneuver them not only on the battlefield, but also through clever military tactics and psychological warfare. He focused on building a well-coordinated force capable of executing his battle strategies with precision. In 1174, the death of Nur ad-Din, the ruler of Syria and a key figure in the Zengid dynasty, created a vacuum of power in the Levant. Saladin quickly seized the opportunity to expand his influence further, taking control of Damascus and other key cities in Syria. With Syria under his control, Saladin now had the resources, manpower, and strategic positioning to move southward and challenge the Crusaders directly. However, Saladin's approach was not one of reckless aggression. He understood that a prolonged war with the Crusaders could weaken his own forces. He was patient, building alliances, strengthening his military, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He sought to divide and conquer, using his diplomatic skills to exploit Crusader weaknesses and turn the fragmented states of the Crusaders against each other. As he prepared to face the Crusaders, Saladin's vision for a unified Muslim world grew clearer. He wasn't just fighting for territory. He was fighting for the future of Islam. His leadership would shape the destiny of the Middle East, and his efforts would inspire generations of Muslims who looked to him as a model of justice, wisdom, and bravery. Saladin's rise to power, his ability to navigate the intricate political and military landscape, and his vision for a united Muslim front were the foundations of his legacy. The stage was set for the Crusades, and Saladin's next move would be to confront the Crusader states in a final showdown, a battle for Jerusalem that would define his place in history. In the years following his consolidation of power in Egypt and Syria, Saladin began to look beyond the borders of his territories, where the Crusaders continued to expand their presence. By 1174, Saladin had firmly established his rule over Egypt and Syria, but the Crusader states along the coast, Jerusalem, Acre, and Antioch, remained a significant challenge. The Crusaders, backed by European powers, had occupied much of the Levant for decades, and their thirst for expansion showed no sign of slowing down. For Saladin, the Crusaders represented both a military threat and a moral imperative to restore Muslim control over lands that had been taken by force. The capture of Jerusalem by the First Crusade in 1099 had left a deep scar on the Muslim consciousness, and the city, sacred to both Muslims and Christians, became a focal point for Saladin's eventual mission to reclaim it. The Crusaders' presence in the region was not only a political issue, but also a religious one. Saladin's personal devotion to Islam made it clear that he could not allow the Crusader states to continue their hold over such significant territories. As Saladin strengthened his military forces and secured alliances across the region, he began to focus his efforts on defeating the Crusaders. Despite his growing power, Saladin understood that a head-on conflict with the Crusaders would require more than just sheer military strength. It would require careful preparation, unity, and a strategic approach. In the meantime, the Crusader states, especially the Kingdom of Jerusalem, were in a state of flux. The Crusader kings were often embroiled in internal disputes, and their unity was far from assured. However, they continued to pose a significant threat, especially as European powers began to plan further crusades aimed at retaking Jerusalem. The Third Crusade loomed large on the horizon, and Saladin knew that he would eventually have to face the combined forces of Europe. Despite the threats, Saladin's position was strong, and his leadership was beginning to gain recognition throughout the Muslim world. His victories in Syria and Egypt had not only secured his control, but also enhanced his reputation as a unifier and defender of Islam. Yet, he understood that the real test of his leadership would come when he confronted the Crusaders head-on, a challenge he knew was inevitable and would require both military genius and political savvy. The rising threat of the Crusaders was now undeniable. Saladin's resolve to reclaim Jerusalem and unite the Muslim world under one banner had begun. His strategic patience and diplomatic efforts would soon set the stage for a series of decisive battles that would reshape the region's future. After firmly securing his rule over Egypt and Syria, Saladin began to look outward toward the Crusader states that threatened his growing empire. His first major military campaigns against the Crusaders were not the large-scale confrontations that would come later, but rather a series of strategic strikes meant to weaken their hold on key territories and disrupt their influence in the Levant. In 1177, Saladin launched a significant offensive against the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. The Crusaders, under King Baldwin IV, a young but determined ruler, had established strongholds in key cities like Acre, Jaffa, and, most importantly, Jerusalem. Saladin's goal was clear: weaken the Crusader presence and position himself for a future, decisive battle. But he was not in a rush. His long-term vision required careful planning, and this early phase was about striking when it made the most strategic sense. The first major clash between Saladin and the Crusaders took place at the Battle of Conquest in 1177. At this critical moment, Saladin's forces were outnumbered by the Crusaders, who were led by King Baldwin IV, a formidable adversary known for his military skill despite suffering from leprosy. The Crusaders were initially confident, thinking that they had the upper hand in terms of both numbers and terrain. However, Saladin's tactical genius shone through. He lured the Crusaders into a trap, allowing them to advance deep into his territory before launching a devastating counterattack. The Battle of Conquest ended in a surprising defeat for the Crusaders. Saladin's forces managed to rout Baldwin's army, sending them fleeing in disarray. This victory sent shockwaves through the Crusader states, signaling to them that Saladin was a force to be reckoned with. It also gave Saladin the momentum he needed to continue his campaign of gradual conquest, undermining Crusader power piece by piece. But Conquest wasn't just a military victory, it was a moral one. It showed the Muslim world that Saladin was not only a capable warrior, but also a strategic thinker who could overcome great odds. His army, despite being smaller, was far more disciplined and motivated, and Saladin's leadership inspired great loyalty from his men. Following this victory, Saladin moved quickly to consolidate his gains. He seized several key fortresses, securing critical positions in Palestine and Transjordan, further isolating the Crusader states. Saladin's forces also began to rebuild the defensive infrastructure of the Muslim territories he controlled, strengthening them to resist any future Crusader attempts to retake lost ground. But Saladin's approach was not just about military conquest, it was also about psychological warfare. He understood that the Crusaders would never simply give up their hold on the Holy Land without a fight. So, Saladin employed a strategy of gradual pressure, focusing on isolating the Crusader forces, making them more vulnerable to attack, and wearing them down over time. This would be a key element in his campaign as he prepared for the larger and more decisive battles that lay ahead. After his stunning victory at Conquest in 1177, Saladin was far from content to rest on his laurels. While the Crusaders were recovering from their defeat, Saladin understood that the only way to ensure his long-term success was to expand his territory and weaken the Crusader states bit by bit. He wasn't interested in large-scale confrontations just yet. Rather, his approach was one of calculated expansion and strategic isolation, cutting off the Crusaders from each other and the resources they relied on. Saladin's next target was the Crusader-held city of Kerak, located in the heart of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Kerak was a critical stronghold for the Crusaders, serving as a key military and logistical hub. If Saladin could capture Kerak, it would not only disrupt Crusader operations, but also send a powerful message to the Crusader states that their position in the Holy Land was under constant threat. In 1183, Saladin laid siege to Kerak, an operation that would test both his military acumen and his patience. The Crusaders, aware of the strategic importance of Carrick, sent reinforcements under Raymond III of Tripoli to bolster the city's defenses. However, Saladin was relentless, deploying a combination of military pressure and psychological tactics to break the Crusader resolve. Saladin's forces surrounded the city, cutting off supply lines and blockading it from the outside world. Over the course of several months, the siege intensified. Raymond's relief forces attempted to break through, but Saladin's forces, using their superior knowledge of the terrain and fortified positions, managed to repulse every Crusader attempt. The siege of Carrick became a test of endurance, where Saladin's patience, discipline, and strategic foresight would ultimately prove decisive. After months of sustained pressure, the Crusaders in Carrick were forced to surrender. The city's fall marked a major milestone in Saladin's campaign against the Crusader states. Not only had Saladin captured a crucial Crusader fortress, but he had also sent a clear signal to the Crusaders. Their hold on the Holy Land was tenuous at best, and Saladin was determined to reclaim the territories they had taken by force. This victory was strategically significant for several reasons. It isolated the Crusader states further, cutting off vital supply routes between the Crusader-held cities of Jerusalem and Acre. It also weakened the morale of the Crusaders, who had now seen firsthand Saladin's ability to besiege and take fortified positions. But most importantly, Saladin's success at Carrick solidified his reputation as a relentless and resourceful commander. He was not just a military leader. He was a man of vision, able to balance tactical warfare with long-term strategic planning. Saladin's triumph at Carrick also gave him the leverage needed to further tighten his grip on the Levant. With the Crusaders fractured and their key strongholds under constant siege, Saladin continued to strengthen his position in the region. He focused on consolidating his hold over Syria and Palestine, ensuring that he had the necessary military presence to challenge the Crusaders again when the time was right. As Saladin's power and influence continued to grow in the Levant, the Crusader states were forced to confront the reality of his military and diplomatic prowess. By 1185, after a series of successful campaigns and territorial gains, it became clear that Saladin was not merely a regional threat. He was a force capable of challenging the Crusaders' very existence in the Holy Land. Saladin's strategic advances, including the capture of key fortresses like Carrick and Aleppo, had thrown the Crusader world into disarray. For the first time in decades, the Crusaders found themselves at a disadvantage. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, which had once been a dominant force, was now struggling to hold onto its remaining territories. The Crusader states were fragmented, their internal divisions and constant infighting weakening their ability to mount an effective resistance against Saladin. The Crusaders' once cohesive military campaigns now seemed increasingly ineffective against the unrelenting unity and discipline of Saladin's forces. Faced with this growing threat, the Crusaders realized that they needed to take drastic action. In 1187, they turned to Europe for help. In response, the Pope called for a new crusade, the Third Crusade, and the greatest Christian monarchs of Europe, Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick I Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, prepared to send their armies to the Levant to defend the Crusader states and retake the lands lost to Saladin. The Third Crusade was not just about the military struggle. It was also a religious and symbolic battle. For the Crusaders, the loss of Jerusalem, the most sacred city to Christianity, was a blow that had to be avenged. For Saladin, the reclamation of Jerusalem was both a personal and religious victory, one that would affirm his leadership of the Muslim world and cement his place in history. Saladin, however, was not taken by surprise. By the time the Crusader armies began to organize in Europe, Saladin had already made significant preparations to defend his conquests. His forces were well-trained, highly disciplined, and unified under his leadership. Saladin had spent the previous years not only expanding his territories, but also fortifying his positions, ensuring that his army could withstand a prolonged siege or battle. In response to the looming threat of the Third Crusade, Saladin made a series of strategic alliances with local Muslim rulers and commanders across the Levant to ensure he had the resources to mount an effective defense. His diplomatic efforts were just as important as his military ones, as he sought to prevent any further fragmentation of the Muslim front. He knew that to face the combined might of Europe, he would need the full support of the Muslim world. But even with his growing influence and preparations for the oncoming Crusader invasion, Saladin's strategy was not simply to rely on defense. He understood that the key to victory lay not just in the strength of his forces, but in undermining the Crusaders' unity. He continued to launch calculated strikes against their territories, targeting their weak points, and making it clear that his forces were ready for any challenge the Crusaders might throw at him. With the Third Crusade looming large, the tension between Saladin and the Crusaders was at its peak. Both sides prepared for what would become one of the most decisive and legendary conflicts in the history of the Crusades, the battle for Jerusalem. Saladin's dream of reclaiming the city for Islam was within his grasp, but the Crusaders' resolve was equally strong. What followed would be a series of brutal and strategic confrontations that would define the fate of the Holy Land. As the Crusaders began to mobilize for the Third Crusade, Saladin knew that the coming conflict would be a test of his military genius, his leadership, and his unwavering resolve. By 1187, he had already achieved a series of decisive victories that had strengthened his position and destabilized the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. However, with the full force of Europe on its way to the Levant, Saladin understood that he would need to be prepared for the full weight of the Crusader armies that would soon land on the shores of the eastern Mediterranean. In the months leading up to the Crusader invasion, Saladin's efforts focused not only on military strength but also on strategic defense and the fortification of key positions. Saladin had already laid siege to several important Crusader strongholds, and he continued to make significant military advances in the Levant. His forces had conquered and reclaimed numerous Crusader cities and fortresses, one of the most significant being the capture of Jerusalem in October 1187. Jerusalem, the most coveted of all Crusader cities, had long been under Christian control since the First Crusade. For the Crusaders, its loss was more than just a political defeat. It was a religious catastrophe. To Muslims, however, the city had immense significance as the third holiest site in Islam, after Mecca and Medina. Saladin had long dreamed of recapturing Jerusalem and fulfilling the mission that had driven his campaigns from the start. In the fall of 1187, after months of relentless siege warfare, Saladin's forces finally breached the walls of Jerusalem, and the city fell into Muslim hands. This was a monumental victory for Saladin, not only for the Muslims, but for the entire Islamic world. The recapture of Jerusalem represented the culmination of Saladin's efforts to unite the Muslim world against the Crusaders, and it established him as a legendary figure in both Islamic and Western history. Yet, despite this incredible success, Saladin was fully aware of the looming Crusader response. The loss of Jerusalem had shaken the Christian world, and Europe's monarchs quickly set their sights on retaking the city. With Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick I Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire leading their combined forces, the Crusaders were a formidable threat. Saladin's immediate reaction was to prepare for the Crusaders' advance, making strategic moves to secure Jerusalem and other key territories. While he maintained control over the city, he faced the possibility of a direct assault by the Crusaders. His forces were spread thin, and he knew that holding Jerusalem against such a powerful coalition would be an immense challenge. To defend the city, Saladin strengthened its fortifications, ensuring that the walls and defenses were in prime condition to withstand a siege. In addition to reinforcing Jerusalem, Saladin focused on fortifying other key positions in Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon. His military strategy emphasized creating a network of fortified strongholds that could serve as bastions against the Crusader forces. Saladin also prepared for a possible confrontation at sea, ensuring that his naval forces were ready to resist any Crusader blockades or attacks from the coast. Saladin also used his diplomacy to try to divide the Crusader forces. He knew that the Crusader leaders were often divided in their goals and motivations, and he worked to exploit those rifts, hoping that the Crusaders would fall into disarray before a final confrontation. He sought to create a sense of urgency among the Crusaders, emphasizing the need for swift action before their divisions became more pronounced. As the Third Crusade drew closer, Saladin's resolve was tested, but he was determined not to allow Jerusalem to fall back into the hands of the Crusaders. His leadership had united the Muslim world, and now it was time to put that unity to the test. Saladin knew that the coming battles would define the future of the region, and he was ready to face the Crusaders head-on in a war that would determine the fate of Jerusalem and the Holy Land itself. By 1189, the forces of Europe had finally gathered for the Third Crusade, and the Crusaders were ready to reclaim Jerusalem from Saladin's grasp. The fall of Jerusalem had sent shockwaves throughout Christendom, and the Pope's call to arms was met with enthusiastic responses from some of the greatest military leaders of the era: Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick I Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. Their combined armies, numbering in the tens of thousands, were a formidable threat to Saladin, and he knew that the time for a major confrontation had arrived. The Crusaders' initial landing on the shores of the Levant was met with a determined response from Saladin. His strategy was to delay the Crusader advance and engage them in a war of attrition, stretching their supply lines and forcing them to fight on multiple fronts. Saladin knew that the Crusaders were divided, both in their leadership and their objectives. While Richard was focused on reclaiming Jerusalem, Philip and Frederick had their own agendas, which created opportunities for Saladin to exploit. The first major battle of the Third Crusade occurred in 1190, when the Crusaders attempted to seize the city of Acre, a major Crusader stronghold on the coast of the Levant. Saladin had already fortified the city, and he was determined to prevent the Crusaders from using it as a base of operations. The siege of Acre became one of the longest and most brutal conflicts of the Crusades, lasting over 2 years. During this protracted siege, Saladin faced not only military challenges, but also a moral dilemma. He had captured several Crusader prisoners, and the tension over their fate began to rise. While Saladin was known for his chivalry and mercy, the pressure to execute prisoners mounted, especially as the siege dragged on. Yet, Saladin remained resolute in his commitment to fairness. Ultimately, he negotiated the release of many prisoners in exchange for the Crusaders' retreat, although the harsh conditions of the siege led to countless casualties on both sides. As the siege of Acre continued, Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, attempted to push into the Levant from the east. However, in a dramatic turn of events, Frederick drowned in the Salef River while crossing it, and his army, demoralized by the loss of their leader, began to fall apart. Saladin's forces took advantage of this blow to the Crusader morale, conducting smaller raids to further weaken their position. The fall of Acre in 1191 marked the first major victory for the Crusaders in the Third Crusade. After months of intense siege warfare, the city finally surrendered to the Crusader forces. Saladin, despite his best efforts, had lost one of his key strongholds. However, he remained undeterred, knowing that this battle was just the beginning of a much larger conflict. He had faced defeat before, and he would do so again if necessary. Despite the loss, Saladin's diplomacy and strategic planning remained as sharp as ever. He understood that Acre's fall had not yet sealed Jerusalem's fate. The Crusaders, despite their victory, were still divided and overextended. Saladin continued to regroup, rebuild his forces, and prepare for the inevitable clash with Richard the Lionheart, whose forces had begun to march southward toward Jerusalem. The stage was set for a final showdown that would determine the fate of the Holy Land. Saladin's ability to stay calm and calculated in the face of mounting pressure and adversity was a testament to his strength as a leader. He was ready for the coming challenges, knowing that the Crusaders' resolve could be tested and that the fate of Jerusalem and the Holy Land was still in his hands. After the fall of Acre, the momentum of the Third Crusade shifted dramatically, with Richard the Lionheart assuming the lead in the Crusader efforts. Known for his unwavering courage and military brilliance, Richard quickly became Saladin's most formidable opponent. The English king's reputation had already spread across the Crusader states and beyond, and he was determined to push southward, ultimately to reclaim Jerusalem from Saladin's control. Saladin, ever the strategic thinker, knew that the Crusaders would try to use Acre as a launch point for their final march toward Jerusalem. He had already suffered a significant loss in the siege of Acre, and now he needed to slow Richard's advance and weaken his forces. The Crusaders, exhausted from the lengthy siege, were determined to make their way to the Holy City. But Saladin's forces stood. The two armies were on a collision course, and it was only a matter of time before a decisive engagement took place. Saladin's strategy was to weaken the Crusader forces through guerrilla tactics, attacking their supply lines, harassing their rearguard, and attempting to break the morale of Richard's troops. But Richard, with his cavalry and disciplined soldiers, was an adept tactician, and he made every effort to maintain his army's strength and momentum. The final showdown occurred in 1191 at the Battle of Arsuf, one of the most crucial engagements of the Third Crusade. The battlefield was a stretch of land along the coast, where Saladin's forces had laid in wait, preparing to ambush Richard's advancing army. Saladin had carefully positioned his forces, using his knowledge of the terrain to gain an advantage, while Richard, aware of the imminent threat, deployed his troops in a tight, disciplined formation. At first, Saladin's forces attempted to engage in light skirmishes, hoping to provoke the Crusaders into breaking formation. But Richard, knowing the importance of maintaining control over his forces, held back and waited for the right moment. As the battle raged on, Richard's cavalry made a decisive charge, breaking through Saladin's lines and turning the tide in the Crusaders' favor. The Battle of Arsuf ended in a hard-fought victory for Richard the Lionheart. Despite Saladin's best efforts to outmaneuver and disrupt the Crusader advance, Richard's tactical brilliance on the field proved too much. Richard's forces continued their march south, making their way to the outskirts of Jerusalem, where Saladin's forces were poised for the final confrontation. However, despite the Crusader victory at Arsuf, Saladin was far from defeated. The battle had been costly for both sides, and while Richard had won a tactical victory, Saladin's strategic position remained strong. He had lost a battle, but he had not lost his resolve. The confrontation at Arsuf was just one chapter in a much longer story, a story that would soon come to a head at the gates of Jerusalem. Richard and Saladin's armies would continue to clash, with Jerusalem hanging in the balance. As Saladin regrouped his forces and prepared for the final showdown, he knew that his leadership and his vision for the Muslim world were at stake. Jerusalem, the prize that both sides had fought for so fiercely, was still within Saladin's grasp, but the coming days would prove just how far both men were willing to go to claim it. The year was 1187, and the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem had been under growing pressure from Saladin's forces for several years. The Crusaders, weakened by internal strife and stretched thin across a number of fortresses and cities in the Levant, found themselves at a disadvantage against the determined and unified forces of Saladin. The time had come for a decisive battle, one that would alter the course of the Crusades and seal the fate of the Holy Land for years to come. For Saladin, the Battle of Hattin was the culmination of years of preparation and military strategy. He had already secured key victories against the Crusaders, including the siege of Acre and the capture of key fortresses like Carrick. His forces had systematically weakened the Crusader presence in the region, and now, with Jerusalem still in their hands, the Crusaders represented the last major obstacle in his quest to reclaim the Holy Land. Saladin's intelligence network had been working tirelessly to gather information on the Crusader movements, and in 1187, he saw the opportunity to strike. The Crusader forces, led by King Guy of Lusignan and the Prince of Jerusalem, Raymond III of Tripoli, were encamped near the Lake of Tiberias, preparing for a defensive stand. But Saladin, ever the tactician, knew that the Crusader forces were vulnerable. They were overstretched, disorganized, and lacking the resources to effectively resist a full-scale offensive. Saladin, with his disciplined army and a deep understanding of the terrain, knew he had the upper hand. Saladin's forces began their movements early in the summer of 1187, laying siege to key Crusader strongholds in the region and cutting off their supplies. As the Crusader army moved out of Jerusalem to engage Saladin's forces, they unwittingly walked into a trap. Saladin, knowing the Crusaders' strategy and weaknesses, drew them out into the open, far from their fortified positions. The Crusader forces, led by King Guy, made the fatal mistake of leaving Jerusalem and taking their army into the open plains near Hattin, a location that would soon become synonymous with their downfall. Saladin's forces quickly surrounded the Crusader army, trapping them with nowhere to retreat. Saladin had anticipated this moment for years, and now, With the Crusaders cut off from water and supplies, he was ready to strike. The stage was set for the Battle of Hattin, a battle that would be fought with intensity and brutality, but also with a level of strategic brilliance that would cement Saladin's place as one of the greatest military leaders in history. The outcome of this battle would decide not only the fate of Jerusalem, but the fate of the entire Crusader presence in the Holy Land. The stage was set for one of the most decisive confrontations of the Crusades. On July 4th, 1187, the Battle of Hattin began, a battle that would change the course of history and forever alter the fate of the Holy Land. Saladin's forces, having methodically surrounded the Crusader army, now moved in for the kill. What would unfold on the scorching plains near the Lake of Tiberias was not only a battle of military might, but a test of leadership, strategy, and endurance. The Crusader army, led by King Guy of Lusignan, had ventured out from their stronghold in Jerusalem to face Saladin in open combat. The decision to march out, away from the safety of their fortifications, would prove to be a costly one. The Crusaders were unprepared for the maneuvering of Saladin's army, which had been carefully orchestrating a brilliant trap. As the Crusaders began their march toward Hattin, they were already facing logistical challenges. The summer heat was unbearable, and Saladin's forces had cut off their access to fresh water. The Crusaders were forced to march through burning heat, parched and exhausted, with their supplies dwindling. This lack of water would prove to be their fatal flaw. Saladin's forces, on the other hand, were well supplied and ready for battle. When the two armies finally met, Saladin's forces were positioned in a way that forced the Crusaders into a vulnerable position. Saladin's army was not just large, it was highly disciplined, mobile, and strategically positioned to strike at key points in the Crusader ranks. His forces surrounded the Crusaders, who were already weakened by thirst, fatigue, and poor morale. The Crusaders had no choice but to form a defensive circle, hoping to protect their vulnerable flanks. The Battle of Hattin was a fierce and brutal fight, but Saladin's superior strategy and tactical brilliance were apparent from the start. His forces began by attacking the Crusader flanks, encircling them and steadily pushing them into a tightening noose. As the battle raged, Saladin's forces moved in to seize the Crusader standards, the symbolic heart of their military strength, and, in doing so, demoralized the already beleaguered Crusader army. The turning point of the battle came when Saladin ordered his forces to target the Crusader knights, the elite of their military. These knights, weighed down by heavy armor, were vulnerable in the heat and chaos of battle. Saladin's light cavalry, superior in agility and speed, picked them off one by one. The Crusader knights were trapped and destroyed, their famed chivalric pride unable to hold against the relentless pressure from Saladin's forces. By the end of the day, the Crusaders were utterly defeated. The battlefield was littered with the bodies of fallen soldiers, both knights and infantry alike. King Guy, along with many of the high-ranking Crusader leaders, was captured. Saladin, ever the tactician, had not only destroyed the Crusader army, but also captured key prisoners, including many of the Crusader nobility. The Battle of Hattin was a decisive victory for Saladin. It shattered the Crusader presence in the Levant and left the path clear for his next move, the conquest of Jerusalem. Saladin's victory at Hattin did not just mark the fall of an army. It marked the fall of a dream that had been held by the Crusaders for nearly a century. Jerusalem, the prize of the Crusades, was now within Saladin's grasp. The Battle of Hattin was a monumental victory for Saladin, but it was not just a military triumph. It was the beginning of the final chapter in his long-standing campaign to reclaim Jerusalem. With the Crusader army in disarray and their leadership in captivity, Saladin stood on the precipice of one of the greatest achievements of his life. The path to Jerusalem was now clear, and the holy city, the ultimate prize of the Crusades, was within his grasp. In the aftermath of the battle, Saladin's forces took control of the battlefield, recovering the Crusader standards and capturing prisoners. Among those captured were key figures such as King Guy of Lusignan, Raymond III of Tripoli, and several other high-ranking Crusader leaders. Saladin, despite the victory, remained calm and composed, choosing to treat the captured Crusaders with dignity and honor, an act that would later become part of his legacy as a ruler known for his mercy. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Saladin chose not to execute his prisoners, but instead offered them ransom or allowed them to be released. However, the Crusader losses were devastating. The defeat at Hattin not only destroyed their military strength but also shattered the morale of the Christian forces. Jerusalem, once a beacon of hope for the Crusaders, was now surrounded by Saladin's forces, and their hold on the Holy Land was rapidly crumbling. The loss of Hattin essentially signaled the collapse of the Crusader kingdom in the Levant. Saladin wasted no time after the battle. He knew that Jerusalem was the ultimate prize and that its capture would cement his reputation as one of the most formidable leaders of his time. The Crusader remnants, scattered and leaderless, had no means of mounting an effective defense. Saladin's next move was calculated and precise. He began his march toward Jerusalem, but with the grace of a seasoned tactician. Before advancing, Saladin ensured that his army was well prepared for the siege of the city. Jerusalem was heavily fortified, and its defenders, led by Balian of Ibelin, a noble of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, had no intention of surrendering easily. Saladin took careful steps to cut off any remaining Crusader reinforcements, ensuring that Jerusalem would be completely isolated. His forces besieged the city from every side, blocking off any potential escape routes for the defenders. Saladin also turned to the Muslim leaders in surrounding regions, calling for reinforcements to ensure the strength of his army in the coming weeks. Damascus, Aleppo, and other key Muslim cities sent troops to bolster Saladin's forces. It was not only a military effort, it was a religious one, with the people of the Muslim world seeing this as a divine opportunity to reclaim the sacred city. As Saladin prepared for the final siege, he made efforts to negotiate with the defenders of Jerusalem. His goal was not only to reclaim the city, but to do so with minimal bloodshed. Saladin's reputation for mercy would be put to the test. Would he allow the Christian inhabitants of Jerusalem to leave peacefully, or would he resort to the bloodshed that had often characterized Crusader victories in the past? The siege of Jerusalem would be a defining moment in Saladin's career, a test of his leadership, military strategy, and compassion. Saladin was now positioned not just as a military commander, but as a symbol of the unification and restoration of the Muslim world. The outcome of the siege would determine the fate of Jerusalem and the fate of the Crusader presence in the Levant for years to come. With the Crusaders in full retreat after their crushing defeat at Hattin, Saladin's forces began the systematic siege of Jerusalem, the ultimate prize that had been the goal of the Crusades for nearly a century. The city, sacred to Christians, Muslims, and Jews alike, now faced the might of Saladin's military, unified, disciplined, and determined. Saladin, having spent the years before meticulously preparing for this moment, knew that this would be his greatest challenge yet. The stakes were immense. Not only did the fate of the Holy Land hang in the balance, but Saladin's reputation as a ruler and conqueror would be solidified by the city's fate. The siege began in earnest in September 1187, as Saladin's forces surrounded the city on all sides. Jerusalem was well defended, its walls thick and fortified, a testament to the efforts of the Crusaders who had held it for nearly 90 years. The defenders, led by Balian of Ibelin, were determined not to surrender without a fight. Balian, a Crusader noble, had spent much of his time rallying the Christian defenders and fortifying the city's defenses in anticipation of the Muslim attack. He knew that holding Jerusalem was a matter of great importance, not only for the survival of his people, but for the future of Christian control in the Levant. Saladin, however, had several advantages. His forces were better supplied, and he had a well-coordinated strategy for dealing with the siege. One of Saladin's first actions was to cut off Jerusalem's water supply, a crucial step in weakening the defenders. The city's resources were limited, and without the water supply from nearby wells and cisterns, the defenders would soon find themselves unable to resist a prolonged siege. As Saladin's forces began to encircle the city, the defenders realized they could not hold out indefinitely without essential resources. Saladin also employed psychological warfare during the siege, seeking to break the spirit of the defenders and force a negotiated surrender. Knowing that the city was under immense pressure, Saladin offered a peaceful solution to Balian and the Christian leaders within the walls. He sent emissaries to offer a safe passage for the civilians and a fair ransom for the Crusader knights, a stark contrast to the brutality that the Crusaders had often employed during their own conquests. Despite the mounting pressure, Balian and his fellow leaders refused to surrender without first exhausting all options. As days turned into weeks, the situation inside Jerusalem grew increasingly dire. Food and water ran low, and the morale of the Crusader defenders began to wane. In the meantime, Saladin's army continued to pressure the city with siege tactics, using catapults, siege towers, and constant bombardment to wear down the fortifications. As the siege dragged on, Saladin's forces made it clear that they were prepared to give the defenders two choices: surrender or face the consequences. Saladin's reputation for mercy and honor was well known, and he hoped to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. He made it clear that he was not interested in massacring the civilians, but rather, his goal was to reclaim Jerusalem peacefully if possible, preserving the sanctity of the city. However, the situation grew more desperate within the city, and after weeks of resistance, the Christian defenders were pushed to the brink of collapse. The Crusaders, realizing that they could no longer hold out indefinitely, were faced with a difficult decision: surrender the city to Saladin or risk total annihilation. The siege of Jerusalem would become one of the defining moments of the Third Crusade. With Saladin's strategy of patience and negotiation combined with his military might, the Crusaders would soon find themselves on the brink of losing the most coveted city in the Holy Land. Saladin's leadership and vision had brought him to this point, and now the fate of Jerusalem rested in his hands. After weeks of intense pressure and dwindling supplies, the defenders of Jerusalem found themselves with little choice but to come to terms with the inevitable. The walls of the city had withstood Saladin's siege for as long as they could, but hunger, thirst, and the overwhelming force of his army had taken their toll. The once proud Crusader kingdom, which had fought so fiercely for control of the Holy Land, was now on the brink of collapse. As the situation grew more dire, Balian of Ibelin, one of the leading Christian defenders, knew that the survival of his people depended on making a deal with the Muslim commander. Despite the mounting pressure to continue resisting, Balian sought a peaceful resolution that would spare the lives of the civilians and avoid unnecessary bloodshed. He sent an emissary to Saladin, seeking terms for the surrender of the city. Saladin, aware of the moral and strategic importance of Jerusalem, agreed to a meeting with Balian. The two leaders, representing vastly different worlds, Saladin, the Muslim general who sought to restore Islam's control over the city, and Balian, the Christian knight determined to protect his people, entered into negotiations that would determine the fate of the holy city. Saladin, known for his honor and compassion, offered generous terms for the Crusaders. He agreed to allow the Christian defenders to leave the city peacefully, provided they paid a ransom for their release. The civilians, including the women, children, and elderly, would also be allowed to leave unharmed. In return, Saladin asked for the surrender of the city and the keys to the holy sites that were sacred to both Christians and Muslims. The terms of the agreement were seen by many as a remarkable gesture of mercy. Unlike the Crusaders, who had often resorted to violence and slaughter during their conquests, Saladin was offering the Christians a dignified exit. He promised to preserve the Christian holy sites, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and assured that they would be protected under Muslim rule. It was a contrast to the brutality the Crusaders had often inflicted upon Muslim cities and civilians during their campaigns. Yet, despite the generous terms, the Crusader defenders had little choice but to agree to the surrender. They had no means of holding the city against Saladin's vastly superior forces. Balian, recognizing that continuing the fight would only lead to the destruction of his people, agreed to the terms on October 2nd, 1187. The keys to Jerusalem were handed over to Saladin, and the Crusader forces, along with the Christian civilians, were allowed to leave the city under the safe conduct promised by the Muslim leader. Saladin's mercy in dealing with the Crusaders earned him respect and admiration, both from the Muslims and even some of his enemies. He had reclaimed the most important city in the Holy Land with remarkable restraint, and rather than resorting to violence or retribution, he chose to show mercy, thereby ensuring the continued sanctity of Jerusalem. As Saladin entered the holy city in triumph, he was greeted by his soldiers and the Muslim population, who celebrated the return of Jerusalem to Islamic rule. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the most sacred site for Christians, was now under the protection of the Muslim ruler, and Saladin made good on his promise to preserve its sanctity. The surrender of Jerusalem was not just a military victory for Saladin. It was a symbolic triumph for Islam. After nearly a century of Crusader occupation, the city had finally returned to Muslim hands. The victory not only solidified Saladin's position as the preeminent leader of the Muslim world, but also marked the high point of his campaign to reclaim the Holy Land. Yet, for all his triumph, Saladin remained humble, reminding his followers that the conquest of Jerusalem was a divine victory, not just a military one. The conquest of Jerusalem in 1187 marked a pivotal moment in history, not just for the Muslim world, but for the Christian and Jewish populations who held the city sacred. For Saladin, the reclamation of Jerusalem was the culmination of years of military campaigns, alliances, and strategic brilliance. It wasn't just a military victory, it was a spiritual triumph, and it solidified his place in history as one of the greatest leaders of his time. The capture of Jerusalem sent shockwaves through both the Islamic and Christian worlds. For Muslims, it was a moment of immense pride and relief. Jerusalem, long held by the Crusaders, was finally returned to Islamic rule. It was a symbol of the strength and unity of the Muslim world under Saladin's leadership, and the victory had profound religious significance. Saladin's promise to protect the holy sites in Jerusalem, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, ensured that the city remained sacred to all faiths, and his generosity in treating Christian civilians and soldiers alike further cemented his reputation as a ruler of mercy and honor. In the Christian world, the loss of Jerusalem was a crushing blow. The Crusaders had fought for nearly a century to secure the city, and its capture by Saladin was seen as a great defeat. However, even in the midst of this tragedy, the Crusader response was swift. The Third Crusade had already been set in motion, and the loss of Jerusalem would galvanize Europe to respond. Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick I Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire all prepared to send their forces to retake Jerusalem from Saladin's control. But Saladin's victory, while decisive, would not be the final chapter in the Crusader-Muslim conflict. The Third Crusade would bring Richard face to face with Saladin in the battle for the Holy Land, and the war was far from over. Despite the Crusader response, Saladin's legacy as a conqueror and leader was solidified with the conquest of Jerusalem. His leadership had united the Muslim world, overcoming its divisions and creating a force capable of reclaiming lands once lost to the Crusaders. Saladin's military genius and strategic brilliance were evident in his ability to defeat the Crusaders at Hattin, to conduct a successful siege of Jerusalem, and to offer terms of surrender that were both humane and magnanimous. His ability to balance the art of war with the principles of mercy and diplomacy became a hallmark of his rule. Saladin's conquest of Jerusalem also set a precedent for future generations of leaders. His reputation as a man of honor and justice transcended both the Muslim and Christian worlds. In the Islamic world, he became a heroic figure, remembered not only for his military victories, but for his commitment to the welfare of his people, his adherence to the principles of Islam, and his humility in victory. His legacy lived on in the sultans, emirs, and other leaders who would follow in his footsteps. In the West, Saladin became a legendary figure in the Crusader narrative. Even though he was the enemy, Richard the Lionheart and other Crusader leaders admired his courage, honor, and fairness in battle. Saladin's reputation for chivalry was so remarkable that even the Crusaders could not help but acknowledge his leadership qualities. Stories of his wisdom, bravery, and generosity were passed down through generations, ensuring that his name would be remembered long after the Holy Land was lost and regained. In the broader historical context, the conquest of Jerusalem marked the end of an era for the Crusaders and the beginning of a new phase in the history of the Holy Land. Saladin's victory did not just change the political landscape. It changed the way in which the region was viewed and shaped the relationship between Islam and Christianity for centuries to come. Saladin's leadership, marked by his military brilliance, compassion, and spiritual devotion, would remain a touchstone of greatness for centuries. His conquest of Jerusalem was not simply a victory in battle. It was a triumph of principle, a reminder that honor and justice were just as important as victory itself. His legacy lives on, not only in the annals of history, but also in the hearts and minds of those who seek to understand the delicate balance of power. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 was nothing short of a disaster for the Crusader states. For nearly a century, the city had been the crown jewel of the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, and its loss to Saladin sent shockwaves through both the Christian world and the Muslim world. The city's significance to Christianity could not be overstated. It was the holiest of sites, the place where Jesus Christ was crucified, and for the Crusaders, its capture in the First Crusade had been their most important achievement. To lose it to a Muslim leader was seen as an affront to the faith and a challenge to Christendom itself. The Pope, Urban III, upon hearing of the news, was devastated. The loss of Jerusalem not only threatened the Crusader presence in the Holy Land, but was a blow to Christian morale. The Pope had spent much of his papacy supporting the Crusader efforts, and now he saw the need for a powerful response. The papal call for the Third Crusade came swiftly, rallying Christian kings and knights across Europe to take up arms once more. This new crusade, it was hoped, would reclaim Jerusalem from Saladin and restore Christian dominance in the Levant. The call for the Third Crusade was not just about religious duty. It was about honor and the prestige of Christendom. The loss of Jerusalem had undermined the Crusaders' authority and was a major blow to the Christian identity in the Holy Land. In addition to the religious motivation, there was also a sense of personal and political pride involved. The kings of Europe, particularly those of England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, saw this as an opportunity to prove their leadership and claim the mantle of Crusader kings. At the heart of this new crusade were three great monarchs. Richard I of England known as Richard the Lionheart, Philip II of France, also called Philip Augustus, and the aging but formidable Frederick I Barbarossa, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Each of these rulers had their own motivations for participating in the crusade, but they were united by a common cause, the retaking of Jerusalem. Richard the Lionheart, the most famous of these Crusader leaders, was eager to demonstrate his strength and leadership on the battlefield. Known for his military prowess, Richard had already earned a reputation across Europe as a brilliant commander. His desire to lead the Crusaders was not only driven by religious zeal, but also by his ambition to secure his place in history as a great Christian king. Philip II of France, too, saw this as a crucial moment to solidify his position as a ruler. Though he had his own ambitions for the Holy Land, his relationship with Richard was complicated by personal and political rivalry. Their alliance, while essential, will be tested by their differing agendas and personalities. Lastly, Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, represented the might of the German-speaking world. His participation was seen as a show of unity for Christendom, especially given the German Crusader presence in the Levant. However, Barbarossa's age and the challenges of leading such a large and diverse army would prove to be difficult factors in the Crusade's overall success. The Third Crusade was thus set in motion, a massive military and religious campaign that would bring together the greatest Christian monarchs of the time. But before the Crusaders could face Saladin on the battlefield, they had to navigate their own internal challenges, disputes between the leaders, logistical issues, and the task of assembling a vast army for a long and arduous journey to the east. The Crusader response to Saladin's conquest of Jerusalem had now begun, but the outcome was far from certain. The Crusaders had one goal: to reclaim Jerusalem. But Saladin, having secured the city and established control over much of the Levant, was not about to relinquish it easily. A clash of titanic proportions was inevitable, one that would not only determine the fate of Jerusalem, but also shape the future of the Holy Land. As the call for the Third Crusade spread across Europe, the Christian kingdoms began preparing for the monumental task ahead. The leaders of the Crusade, Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick I Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, knew that the journey would be long and dangerous, requiring meticulous preparation and coordination. This was not just another military campaign. It was a religious duty, a quest for redemption, and a fight for the very soul of Christendom. The logistics of assembling an army of such magnitude were a monumental challenge. Crusaders came from various regions of Europe, and each leader was tasked with organizing supplies, soldiers, and ships. The Crusader armies would need to sail across the Mediterranean, gather at key ports, and travel by sea to the Levant. The sheer scale of the operation was unprecedented, requiring immense resources and the cooperation of various kingdoms and noble houses. Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, was the first of the Crusader kings to embark on the journey. With his German army, he set out overland, crossing through Eastern Europe and into the Byzantine Empire. Frederick's personal resolve and military experience were unmatched, and many in Europe viewed his participation as the rallying cry for the Crusade. His army, however, faced several obstacles. Crossing the Byzantine Empire was tricky, as tensions between the Crusaders and the Byzantine Empire still lingered from previous Crusades. There were also logistical challenges related to the vastness of his forces, which included not only knights and soldiers, but also supply trains, artillery, and even camp followers. For Frederick, the journey was not only about military conquest, it was about the reputation of the Holy Roman Empire. But tragically, Frederick I. Barbarossa died during the crossing of the Salif River in 1190, an event that shocked Europe and dealt a heavy blow to the Crusader cause. His army, leaderless and demoralized, was forced to turn back, and the German contingent of the Crusade was significantly weakened. Meanwhile, Richard the Lionheart and Philip II of France were busy preparing their forces in Western Europe. Richard, ever the charismatic leader, had already assembled an impressive army, but his difficulties in recruiting and raising funds from his kingdom meant that the preparations took longer than anticipated. Nonetheless, Richard's determination to lead the Crusaders to victory was clear. He used his royal resources and personal wealth to ensure that his army was ready for the long march east. In contrast, Philip II of France was able to mobilize his forces more swiftly. France had been well prepared for the Crusade, and Philip's soldiers were eager to join the expedition. However, there was a sense of rivalry between Philip and Richard, with both kings vying for leadership and influence over the Crusader campaign. Though they were allies in the cause to reclaim Jerusalem, the relationship between the two monarchs was strained by competing ambitions, personal tensions, and a long history of conflict between the English and French crowns. The departure of the Crusader armies began in earnest in 1190, with Richard and Philip both setting sail from Europe. Richard's fleet left from Marseilles, while Philip's forces embarked from France. The two armies would eventually meet in the Levant, where they would face off against Saladin's forces. But before that, the Crusaders' path would be fraught with peril, including the challenges of crossing hostile waters, navigating political tensions in the Byzantine Empire, and facing the harsh realities of the long journey east. Despite the obstacles they faced, the Crusaders knew the stakes were high. Their goal was not just to retake Jerusalem. It was to reclaim the Holy Land for Christianity and secure Christendom's influence over the region. The Third Crusade was now fully underway, but the challenges of coordinating such a massive campaign would test the Crusaders' resolve and leadership. As the armies gathered, it became increasingly clear that this would be a war of attrition, and Saladin's forces would not give up easily. The stage was set for a clash of kings, with the fate of Jerusalem hanging in the balance. After a long and arduous journey across the Mediterranean, the Crusader armies, led by Richard the Lionheart and Philip II of France, finally arrived in the Levant. The seas were treacherous, and many of their ships were damaged during the journey. But despite these setbacks, both kings and their forces disembarked at Acre, a critical Crusader stronghold that had been under siege by Saladin's forces for years. This marked the beginning of the Third Crusade's military operations on the ground. The situation in Acre was dire. The city had been surrounded by Saladin's army, and the Crusaders inside were desperate for relief. The siege of Acre had been ongoing for 2 years, with Saladin making it one of the most fiercely contested battles in the Crusader Muslim struggle for the region. Saladin's forces had cut off vital supplies, leaving the city on the brink of starvation. The arrival of the Crusader relief forces was a lifeline for the besieged Crusaders inside. As the Crusaders assembled on the shores of Acre, Saladin quickly understood that he would face a formidable force. With the addition of Richard and Philip's armies, the The Crusader strength in the region had grown significantly. But Saladin was not one to shy away from battle. He recognized the strategic importance of Acre and knew that he could not allow it to fall into the hands of the Crusaders without a fight. The first major engagement between the Crusaders and Saladin's forces after their arrival was a battle for control of the port of Acre. The Crusaders, well-armed and determined, launched an all-out assault on Saladin's forces who were entrenched around the city. Richard the Lionheart, known for his military prowess, took charge of the Crusader assault. His forces, though exhausted from their journey, were well coordinated, and Richard's leadership on the battlefield quickly became apparent. Saladin, aware of the importance of the port and the city, attempted to counter the Crusader assault with both his elite cavalry and archers, making use of his forces' speed and agility. The Crusader siege engines pounded the walls of Acre as the Crusader knights advanced, but the battle was far from over. For weeks, the two sides engaged in fierce skirmishes, with both sides suffering significant casualties. The Crusader forces slowly began to gain the upper hand. They eventually managed to breach the walls of Acre, and after much fighting, the city fell into Crusader hands in July 1191. Despite the heavy toll on both sides, Richard's forces were victorious. The fall of Acre was a pivotal moment in the Third Crusade. It marked the first major victory for the Crusaders since the loss of Jerusalem in 1187, and it gave them a foothold in the Levant from which they could continue their campaign to retake the city. However, the victory at Acre was not without its moral and political costs. After the city's surrender, Saladin and Richard engaged in a highly controversial exchange. Saladin offered a ransom for the Crusader prisoners he had captured, but Richard, who was known for his ruthless pragmatism, chose to execute many of the Muslim prisoners taken during the siege. This act of retribution, where 700 Muslim prisoners were beheaded, sent shockwave through both the Muslim and Christian worlds. Saladin, despite his losses, continued to maintain the moral high ground, and his reputation for honor and restraint in warfare only grew stronger in the face of such brutality. The victory at Acre had set the stage for the next phase of the Third Crusade, but it also intensified the rivalry between Saladin and Richard the Lionheart. Richard was now one of the most powerful and influential kings of Europe, and Saladin knew that the battle for the Holy Land would only escalate as the Crusaders marched southward toward Jerusalem. Despite the bloodshed, Saladin's determination to defend Jerusalem and drive the Crusaders from the Levant remained unshaken. The Third Crusade was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. As the Crusaders gathered their strength after the capture of Acre, Saladin too began to reorganize his forces, preparing for the inevitable clash with Richard's army. Following the hard-won victory at Acre in July 1191, Richard the Lionheart and Philip II of France began their long-awaited march south toward Jerusalem. With the capture of Acre, the Crusaders now had a secure base of operations and a foothold in the Levant. The path to Jerusalem seemed clear, and after years of setbacks, the Crusaders were ready to strike at the heart of the Holy Land. But the road to Jerusalem would not be an easy one. Saladin, having lost Acre, was not about to let the city fall into Crusader hands without a fight. Saladin's forces, though stretched thin, were determined to defend Jerusalem at all costs. As Richard and Philip advanced, Saladin sought to slow their progress and disrupt their supply lines. His forces, consisting of light cavalry, archers, and infantry, harassed the Crusaders, forcing them to fight on multiple fronts and slowing their advance. The Crusaders, despite their superior numbers, were forced to contend with the harsh terrain, scorched earth tactics, and the relentless hit-and-run raids conducted by Saladin's forces. Richard, known for his strategic brilliance and relentless drive, kept his army moving toward Jerusalem despite the continuous delays. He knew that time was critical. The longer it took to reach the city, the more likely it was that the Crusader morale would waver and that Saladin could gather reinforcements from across the Muslim world. Saladin, fully aware of this, was doing everything he could to ensure that the Crusaders would not have an easy path to the Holy City. The journey to Jerusalem was grueling. The Crusaders faced the scorching heat of the Levantine summer, and their supply lines were stretched thin. Tensions rose within the Crusader ranks as the march continued. Philip II, the King of France, had his own concerns. His relationship with Richard was growing increasingly strained. Although they had worked together to capture Acre, Philip's desire to pursue his own interests in the Holy Land had become evident. Eventually, in 1191, after the Crusader victory at Acre, Philip withdrew from the crusade and returned to France, leaving Richard to lead the remaining forces in the campaign. While Philip's departure weakened the Crusader ranks, it did not stop Richard's resolve. Richard the Lionheart, with his characteristic energy and military acumen, continued leading his army toward Jerusalem. Saladin, however, was not idle. Despite the Crusader victories at Acre, Saladin was fully aware that the fate of Jerusalem was now at stake. He gathered reinforcements from Syria and Egypt, preparing for the inevitable confrontation with Richard's forces. Saladin's strategy during this period was one of delaying and outmaneuvering. He knew that he could not engage the Crusader forces head-on in open battle. His forces were not as numerous, and he needed time to regroup and reinforce his positions. Instead, he relied on his superior knowledge of the terrain and his ability to exploit weaknesses in the Crusader lines. His light cavalry and swift movements made it difficult for Richard's army to pin him down. Saladin understood that the longer the Crusaders took to reach Jerusalem, the more likely it was that their commitment would falter. He knew that time was on his side. In August 1191, Richard reached the town of Arsuf, located just north of Jerusalem, where Saladin had stationed his forces. The Crusader army was now in position to engage Saladin in a decisive battle, but Saladin was waiting for the right moment to strike. Despite their differences, Richard's army and Saladin's forces were heading toward a final confrontation. The fate of Jerusalem hung in the balance, and the coming battle would be a turning point in the Third Crusade. Saladin, for all his mastery in guerrilla tactics, understood that the time had come for a decisive confrontation. The battle for Jerusalem was about to take shape, but Richard's strategic genius would soon put Saladin's resolve to the test. After weeks of marching through the blistering heat of the Levant, Richard the Lionheart's Crusader army reached Arsuf in late August of 1191, positioned just north of Jerusalem. The Crusaders had been steadily advancing toward the Holy City, but Saladin's forces, always one step ahead, harassed them constantly, forcing them to deal with skirmishes, supply disruptions, and ambushes. Saladin's strategy had been to delay and exhaust the Crusaders, hoping that their morale would falter before they could reach Jerusalem. Now, with both armies positioned near Arsuf, the stage was set for a decisive confrontation. Saladin, having observed Richard's tactics and knowing the Crusader king's reputation as a brilliant military strategist, sought an opportunity to attack. He positioned his forces along a stretch of open terrain, hoping to lure Richard into a trap. Saladin's forces, composed of light cavalry, archers, and infantry, were agile and well-coordinated. They knew that a direct confrontation with Richard's heavily armored knights and infantry could be risky, so Saladin's plan was to wear down the Crusaders through hit-and-run tactics. For Richard, this battle would be a critical test of his leadership. He knew that his troops were exhausted, both physically and mentally, after months of travel and constant skirmishes. The morale of the Crusader army was shaky, but Richard's resolve remained unshaken. He decided to take the offensive at Arsuf, hoping to end the months of harassment and pave the way for the final push toward Jerusalem. Richard's goal was not just to defeat Saladin's forces, but to send a message, one that would restore the confidence of his men and demonstrate the power of Christendom in the Holy Land. The battle began early on September 7th, 1191, with Saladin's forces attempting to engage the Crusaders in a series of hit-and-run attacks. Saladin's cavalry would charge in waves, targeting the Crusader flanks, and then retreat before the Crusaders could mount a counterattack. His goal was to provoke a rash response, hoping that Richard's men would break formation in pursuit of his forces. However, Richard, well aware of Saladin's tactics, held his ground and kept his army in tight formation, refusing to fall into the trap. As the battle progressed, Saladin's forces launched more attacks, hoping to test the Crusaders' resolve. The constant harassment took a toll on the Crusader lines, but Richard was unrelenting. At a critical moment, Richard's cavalry, led by his personal command, launched a counteroffensive. With the Crusaders holding firm and Saladin's forces struggling to maintain their coordinated attacks, the Crusader cavalry broke through Saladin's lines, forcing the Muslim forces to retreat. The Battle of Arsuf ended in a decisive victory for Richard the Lionheart and the Crusaders. Saladin's forces, though not completely destroyed, were forced to pull back and regroup. Despite the victory, Richard's army suffered significant losses, and the battle was a reminder that the Crusader advance toward Jerusalem was far from assured. Saladin, though defeated, was far from broken. His forces regrouped and retreated, readying themselves for the next phase of the campaign. The significance of the Battle of Arsuf was not just military. It was a psychological boost for the Crusaders. After months of harassment and several military setbacks, Richard's victory restored confidence in the Crusader cause and showed the Muslim world that the Crusaders were capable of defeating Saladin's forces in open battle. The battle also marked a shift in the momentum of the Third Crusade, as the Crusaders, now emboldened, began to march closer to their goal, the reclamation of Jerusalem. However, despite the victory, Richard knew that the ultimate goal was still ahead. The road to Jerusalem was long, and Saladin's forces remained formidable. The Battle of Arsuf had demonstrated the strength of the Crusaders, but it had also shown that Saladin's resolve was unbroken. The Third Crusade was far from over, and the final confrontation for Jerusalem was still to come. Following the victory at Arsuf, Richard the Lionheart and his Crusader forces began their long-awaited march toward Jerusalem, with Saladin's forces still lurking nearby. The battle had rekindled the Crusaders' confidence, and for the first time in years, they felt they might truly be able to reclaim the Holy City. But Richard and his army knew the road to Jerusalem would not be a straight line. Despite their momentum, the Crusaders faced numerous challenges, both military and logistical. Richard's forces were still recovering from the wounds sustained in battle, and the Crusaders were constantly dealing with supply shortages, harsh terrain, and the scorched earth tactics employed by Saladin. As the Crusaders continued their southward march, they faced the reality of having to deal with the consequences of their long and difficult campaign. The road to Jerusalem was littered with strategic decisions, and Richard's leadership would be tested further. Saladin, ever the tactical mastermind, was aware that the Crusader approach to Jerusalem was inevitable. However, unlike the Crusaders, Saladin had already prepared for a prolonged defense. He was no longer in the same position of power as he had been earlier in the Crusade. His forces had been significantly weakened by the battle at Arsuf, and the constant pressure from the Crusaders was wearing him thin. However, Saladin refused to give up the city without a fight. His pride and determination to protect Jerusalem kept him focused on the task at hand. Realizing the situation was dire, Saladin engaged in diplomatic efforts. He sought to negotiate with the Crusaders, offering terms for a peaceful surrender of Jerusalem. However, Richard, having already shown his resolve and military skill, remained focused on the prize. Despite Saladin's offers of safe passage for the Christian inhabitants and a possible compromise on the city's control, Richard knew that only a military solution would truly secure Jerusalem for the Christian world. He would not be swayed by negotiations alone. At the same time, Richard was not blind to the moral implications of continuing the fight. He was deeply aware of the sacrifices his men had made and the losses sustained in the crusade. He knew that Jerusalem was not just about military conquest. It was about restoring Christian honor, unity, and purpose in the face of a long and painful conflict. Richard sought to balance the military urgency with a desire for peace, but the stubbornness of both sides made a negotiated settlement increasingly difficult. As Richard continued his march toward Jerusalem, he also faced internal challenges within his own ranks. The French contingent, led by Philip II, had already withdrawn from the crusade, and Richard was left to continue the march with only his English forces and a handful of other allies. The absence of Philip was a blow to the Crusaders' unity, but Richard, ever the strategist, pressed on. Meanwhile, Saladin continued to organize his forces and strengthen the defenses of Jerusalem. His infantry, cavalry, and siege defenses were fortified, and he knew that any Crusader attempt to take the city would result in a costly and prolonged siege. His men were loyal, but the realities of war, along with the ongoing diplomatic negotiations, made it unclear how long he could hold out against Richard's determined army. In the weeks leading up to the final siege, both sides continued to gather reinforcements. Saladin, aware that time was running out, rallied troops from Syria and Egypt, while Richard, despite his smaller army, relied on his elite English knights and the skill of his commanders. The stage was set for a final showdown that would decide the fate of Jerusalem, a battle that would not only determine the future of the Holy Land, but also set the stage for the ongoing conflict between the Christian West and the Muslim East. The Crusader army, now fully focused on the conquest of Jerusalem, was about to face its greatest test yet. As both sides prepared for the final conflict, the outcome of the Third Crusade hung in the balance. Saladin's defenses were strong, but Richard's determination and military brilliance had already proven formidable. The battle for Jerusalem was drawing near, and it would be a fight that would determine not just the fate of the city, but the course of history. By September 1192, the Crusaders had finally reached Jerusalem, the city they had set out to reclaim. Richard the Lionheart's forces, although weary from the long campaign, now stood at the gates of the most sacred city in Christendom. With the fall of Acre and the victories at Arsuf, the Crusaders had regained some momentum, but they knew the real challenge lay ahead. Jerusalem was heavily fortified, and Saladin's forces were prepared for a protracted siege. The Crusaders, having marched for weeks and suffered heavy casualties, now faced a difficult decision. Richard the Lionheart knew that the city could be taken, but the cost would be enormous. Saladin's forces had dug in, prepared to defend the city with the utmost resolve. Despite his previous successes against Saladin, Richard was aware that taking Jerusalem would require extensive resources and a lengthy siege, possibly stretching into the winter months. And that, too, would come at a high cost in both lives and supplies. Saladin, on the other hand, was aware of the situation as well. Despite his previous losses, he had managed to maintain control over Jerusalem and the surrounding regions. The city's walls were formidable, and his forces had entrenched themselves inside, making any attack a costly affair for the Crusaders. He also understood the importance of Jerusalem as a symbol of Muslim pride, and he was determined not to lose it without a fight. However, he had seen the determination of the Crusaders and knew that holding the city indefinitely would be a challenge, especially if Richard could maintain the siege for months. The year 1193 brought with it the loss of one of the most revered and influential figures in the history of Islam. Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt, Syria, and much of the Levant, passed away at the age of 55. His death marked the end of an era in the Muslim world, and his passing was felt deeply by both his followers and adversaries alike. For nearly 2 decades, Saladin had been the unifying figure for the Muslim world, and his leadership in the Third Crusade had solidified his status as a legend. Saladin had been suffering from illness for several months leading up to his death, but even as his health declined, he remained active in affairs of state, overseeing the defense of his empire and maintaining his leadership. The weight of his leadership, the battles, and his constant vigilance had taken a toll on his body, but his spirit and determination remained unbroken until the very end. When he died on March 4th, 1193, at his palace in Damascus, the Muslim world was left to cope with the loss of its greatest military commander and most revered ruler. At the time of his death, Saladin had managed to carve out an empire stretching from Egypt and the Levant to Mesopotamia, with Jerusalem firmly under his control. His vision of a united Muslim front against the Crusaders had come to fruition, and his legacy was inextricably tied to the restoration of Islamic rule over Jerusalem after its loss to the Crusaders nearly 100 years earlier. However, Saladin's death came at a time when the Muslim territories were still in a delicate balance, and his absence left a void that would prove difficult to fill. Saladin had worked tirelessly throughout his life to maintain unity within the Muslim world, but in the wake of his death, factions and rivalries began to resurface. He had left behind a series of strong allies, but also a number of rivals and ambitious figures eager to claim power for themselves. His family, particularly his brothers, would divide the vast empire he had built. His eldest son, Al-Aziz Uthman, succeeded him as the Sultan of Egypt, but the empire was increasingly fractured, with various regions falling under the control of different relatives and generals. The lack of a strong, central authority after Saladin's death led to political instability. His empire, despite its military prowess and unified front during his lifetime, now faced the daunting task of maintaining cohesion and fending off external threats. The Ayyubid dynasty, founded by Saladin, continued to hold power, but the weakening of central authority created opportunities for the Crusaders to regroup and launch new campaigns. In addition to the internal struggles within the Ayyubid family, the external threat of the Crusaders remained a concern. Despite the truce with Richard the Lionheart, Jerusalem had never been fully secured from the Crusader threat. The Crusader states remained entrenched in outposts across the Levant, and their desire to retake Jerusalem persisted. Without Saladin's unifying leadership, the Muslim world faced a much more fragmented response to these threats. In the years following Saladin's death, Saladin's legacy would be honored by many, especially in the Muslim world. He was remembered not only as a brilliant military leader, but also as a man of principle, mercy, and justice. His efforts to preserve religious tolerance, his fair treatment of non-Muslims, and his commitment to chivalry values became central themes of his legacy. Saladin was seen as an example of leadership, both on and off the battlefield, and his reputation would grow with time, especially among future generations of Muslim rulers. However, the succession crisis that followed his death, combined with the growing external Crusader threat, would test whether Saladin's empire could survive without his unifying vision. His family members, though capable, were not able to match his level of influence, and the once mighty Ayyubid dynasty would experience several decades of instability as rival factions within the family and beyond vied for power. After Saladin's death in 1193, the question of who would inherit his vast empire became a contentious issue. The Ayyubid dynasty, founded by Saladin, had been one of the most powerful Muslim empires in the Middle East, but it was also a complex web of alliances and family relationships. Saladin's decision to divide his empire among his brothers and sons would lead to significant political fragmentation and infighting, setting the stage for the challenges that would follow. Saladin's eldest son, Al-Aziz Uthman, succeeded him as the Sultan of Egypt, a critical position that controlled the wealth and military power of the empire. Uthman, though capable, lacked the charisma and leadership abilities that had defined his father's reign. His rule was challenged almost immediately by internal dissent. The Ayyubid Empire was vast, spanning Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and parts of Mesopotamia, and many of the regional governors and military leaders saw an opportunity to assert their own authority. Saladin's brothers, particularly Al-Adil, who controlled Damascus, and Turan Shah, who governed Yemen, also eyed greater power. While Al-Adil proved to be an astute politician, gaining control of Damascus and consolidating his power, he faced resistance from within Saladin's own family, especially from Uthman, who sought to preserve his father's legacy. The rivalries among Saladin's sons, brothers, and other relatives created a series of power struggles that would plague the Ayyubid dynasty for years to come. One of the most significant figures in the post-Saladin period was Al-Adil, Saladin's younger brother. After initially being content with his share of the empire, Al-Adil began to consolidate power in Syria, taking advantage of the power vacuum left by Saladin's death. By 1200, Al-Adil had successfully made himself the de facto ruler of the Ayyubid territories, largely due to his political savvy and ability to gain the support of key factions within the military and religious establishment. However, his rise to power came at the expense of the unity of the Ayyubid Empire, which became increasingly divided along regional lines. Despite his diplomatic efforts, Saladin's family could not match the unity and strength that he had brought to the empire. The division of the empire into regional realms weakened the Ayyubids, making it harder for them to present a unified front against the Crusader states in the Levant. Saladin's son, Al-Aziz, lost control of Egypt after his death in 1198, and the control of Egypt passed to his brother Al-Kamil, another son of Saladin. However, this only intensified the infighting, as Al-Adil continued to expand his influence, and other branches of the family sought to challenge his authority. This fragmentation within the Ayyubid dynasty was not just an internal issue. It had direct consequences on the Crusader-Muslim relations in the region. Without a strong, unified leadership to challenge the Crusader states, the Crusaders began to regain momentum. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, though weakened, remained intact, and other Crusader strongholds in the Levant. The division of Saladin's empire also had significant religious implications. Saladin had been a unifying figure for the Muslim world, known not only for his military successes, but also for his efforts to promote religious tolerance and justice. His ability to balance the needs of different factions, including Sunni and Shia Muslims, as well as Christians and Jews, had earned him respect across the region. However, after his death, this spirit of unity faltered. The Ayyubid family was torn by internal power struggles, and Saladin's successors lacked the ability to bring together the diverse groups within their empire. While Al-Adil sought to stabilize the empire, the continued fragmentation left the Muslim world vulnerable to Crusader advances, as the infighting between the Ayyubid princes consumed much of their focus. The Crusaders, sensing the weakening of their Muslim adversaries, began to strengthen their position, especially in Acre and Antioch. The Third Crusade, despite its outcome, had shown that Saladin's empire was not invincible and that his successors would have to confront new challenges to maintain the gains Saladin had made. The aftermath of Saladin's death in 1193 not only fractured the Ayyubid Empire, but also ignited a power struggle within his family. While Saladin had managed to unite the Muslim territories through both his leadership and diplomacy, his successors lacked his ability to maintain cohesion among the many factions within the empire. The rivalry between Saladin's sons, brothers, and other relatives intensified as each sought to expand their own influence, leading to a fractured Ayyubid dynasty that struggled to retain its former strength. Al-Adil, Saladin's brother, had quickly established himself as the most influential figure in the wake of Saladin's death, taking control of Damascus and effectively becoming the most powerful member of the Ayyubid family. He was an astute politician and military leader, but his rise to power was not without resistance. Many of Saladin's sons, especially Al-Aziz Uthman in Egypt, sought to assert their own claim to leadership, leading to tensions and instability within the dynasty. Al-Adil's power was further challenged by the rising ambitions of Saladin's sons. Al-Aziz, Saladin's eldest son, had inherited Egypt, but his leadership was weak and his rule was short-lived. After his death in 1198, the control of Egypt passed to his brother Al-Kamil. However, the continued competition between the Ayyubid princes in Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia prevented any unified response to external threats. This constant infighting within the family drained the resources and focus needed to maintain the empire's strength and stability. The division between Al-Adil's faction in Syria and the Ayyubid rulers of Egypt became a major source of instability. Al-Adil, having consolidated control of Syria, sought to expand his influence in Egypt, but the Ayyubid brothers and other regional rulers were increasingly resistant to his authority. Al-Kamil, the new Sultan of Egypt, was a capable ruler, but his reign was marked by his inability to fully unite the fractured empire left behind by his father. The fragmentation of Saladin's empire had profound consequences for the Muslim world as a whole. Under Saladin's rule, the empire had been a unified force in the region, able to challenge the Crusaders and maintain a stronghold over the Holy Land. However, the failure of his successors to maintain unity left the Muslim world divided and vulnerable. The lack of a central authority made it difficult to resist the Crusader presence in the Levant, and the infighting among the Ayyubid family gave the Crusaders opportunities to regroup and expand their territories. One of the long-term consequences of this division was the weakening of the Ayyubid dynasty's influence across the Levant and Egypt. Crusader states, particularly in Jerusalem and Acre, began to recover from the setbacks they had suffered under Saladin's reign. The Third Crusade had ended with a truce, but with the Muslim world weakened by internal conflict, the Crusaders were able to rebuild their forces and strengthen their footholds in the region. Saladin's legacy, while still revered as a symbol of Muslim unity and military prowess, became increasingly difficult to maintain. His vision of a united Muslim front against the Crusaders and other threats was slowly unraveling, as the Ayyubid dynasty became more focused on internal rivalries than on resisting the Crusader states. The power vacuum created by Saladin's death left the Muslim world vulnerable to both internal and external challenges, and the Crusaders saw this as an opportunity to regain lost ground. However, Saladin's reputation as a just and merciful ruler continued to endure, even as his empire weakened. His military victories and restoration of Jerusalem were remembered as shining achievements, and his character, marked by honor, piety, and generosity, remained a standard for future Muslim rulers. Even after the Crusaders' resurgence, Saladin's influence on Muslim governance remained profound, and he was often cited as an ideal of leadership that transcended his own lifetime. As the Ayyubid Empire continued to fragment, the legacy of Saladin lived on in the hearts of both Muslims and Crusaders. His spiritual and political vision had inspired a new generation of leaders who sought to bring about unity and justice in a region torn apart by war and division. But, despite the continuing reverence for Saladin, the Muslim world's disunity after his death allowed the Crusaders to make a resurgence, shifting the balance of power in the Levant and ensuring that the struggle for Jerusalem and the Holy Land would continue for decades. After Saladin's death in 1193, the Ayyubid dynasty began to fragment into rival factions, weakening its ability to respond to the ongoing Crusader threat in the Levant. Despite the initial peace brought by the Third Crusade truce, the Crusader states in Jerusalem, Acre, and other key territories in the Holy Land began to regain strength. The power vacuum left by Saladin's passing, combined with the internal struggles of his successors, gave the Crusaders an opportunity to reassert their influence in the region. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, though weakened after the Third Crusade, still held significant strategic importance. The Crusaders, under the leadership of Guy of Lusignan and later Henry II of Cyprus, worked to rebuild their strength. The siege of Acre had severely weakened the Crusaders' hold on the Levant, but they managed to regroup and fortified their positions. Meanwhile, the Franks began to strengthen their alliances with other European powers, such as Venice and Papal support, to maintain their hold on key cities and trading routes. The Ayyubid response to this Crusader resurgence was marked by disunity and conflicting ambitions within the family. While some Ayyubid leaders, like Al-Adil, sought to consolidate control over Syria and Egypt, others were preoccupied with their personal power struggles. This fractured response allowed the Crusaders to recover from their earlier setbacks. The Crusader states began to enjoy a relative period of peace, during which they could rebuild their defenses and military capacity. Al-Adil, Saladin's brother, was one of the key figures in the post-Saladin period, but his attempts to unify the Muslim territories were not always successful. Although he had consolidated power in Damascus and Aleppo, his authority was contested by Saladin's sons, such as Al-Kamil and Al-Aziz, as well as other Ayyubid generals and regional leaders. In some instances, this lack of central control created opportunities for the Crusaders to push into regions once held by Saladin. One of the most significant moments in the aftermath of Saladin's death came in 1197, when the Crusaders managed to recapture Arsuf, a key port city along the coast. The recapture of Arsuf was not just a tactical victory. It symbolized the Crusaders' growing strength in the region. Despite Saladin's earlier victories, the fragmentation of the Muslim world following his death made it difficult to mount a unified response to such incursions. While the Crusaders regained some territory, they also found themselves dealing with the same political instability and internal conflicts that had plagued the Ayyubid dynasty. As the Crusader states grew stronger, they too struggled with internal divisions, particularly between competing factions and rival European powers vying for control over the region. This ongoing instability, both among the Crusaders and the Ayyubids, ensured that the Holy Land remained a volatile and contested territory, where every advantage gained was fleeting, and the situation could change in a matter of months. Although the Crusader resurgence was notable, Saladin's legacy as a unifier remained strong. Even in his death, the spirit of his military campaigns continued to influence the Muslim world, and his example of honor, mercy, and chivalric values remained a beacon for future generations. The Crusaders, while regaining some ground, would find it increasingly difficult to hold onto the Holy Land without facing Saladin's unifying vision. For Saladin's successors, the challenge was to restore the unity and strength that he had fostered, but without the leadership and charisma that had made him so formidable. In the years following Saladin's death, the Crusaders and the Ayyubid factions would continue to clash in an ongoing battle for dominance over the Holy Land. Both sides were now operating in the shadow of Saladin's legacy, and each would have to navigate the complexities of political intrigue, religious motivations, and the harsh realities of military conquest. The ongoing tension between the Crusader states and the Ayyubid dynasty would shape the future of the region for decades to come. Even after his death in 1193, Saladin's legacy continued to cast a long shadow over the Muslim world. His efforts to unify the Muslim territories under a common banner, his military prowess, and his moral character left an indelible mark on history. Despite the fragmentation of the Ayyubid dynasty and the internal power struggles that followed, Saladin's ideals of justice, honor, and religious tolerance would continue to shape the actions of Muslim leaders for generations. In the years immediately following his death, his reputation as a heroic figure only grew. Saladin was celebrated not just for his military victories, but for his chivalric values and fairness. His mercy in dealing with his enemies, particularly the Crusaders, was often highlighted. The capture of Jerusalem in 1187, which had once been a symbol of Muslim unity and a triumph over the Crusaders, became a defining moment of his legacy. Saladin's decision to allow Christian pilgrims access to the city and his humane treatment of prisoners, despite the harsh conditions of war, set him apart from other conquerors of the time. His generosity and commitment to religious tolerance made him a beloved figure not just among Muslims, but also among non-Muslims who admired his principled approach to leadership. In the Muslim world, Saladin was revered as the defender of Islam and the restorer of Jerusalem. His efforts to unite the Muslim factions and fight against the Crusaders made him a symbol of resistance, and his reputation only grew as the Crusaders attempted to reassert their dominance in the region. Even after the Third Crusade, and despite the tensions and division within the Muslim world, Saladin's name became synonymous with victory, honor, and the reclamation of Jerusalem. His diplomatic acumen and ability to unite various Muslim factions, from Sunnis to Shias, also ensured that his legacy lived on as a unifying force in a region that was often fragmented by sectarian and political strife. Beyond his military and diplomatic efforts, Saladin's leadership was also admired for his administrative abilities. His vision for a unified Muslim world was more than just about military conquest. It was about creating a system where justice and fairness prevailed. Saladin's commitment to maintaining Islamic law, particularly the principles of Sharia, allowed him to establish a strong and respected legal framework across his empire. His emphasis on public welfare, building roads, promoting trade, and ensuring charitable works, further solidified his reputation as a leader who cared for the well-being of his people. The administrative systems he set up would continue to influence the governance of the region long after his death. Saladin's personal character also played a significant role in his enduring legacy. His humility, piety, and devotion to Islam made him a model of the ideal Muslim ruler. He was known for his modesty, never seeking wealth or personal glory, but rather focusing on the welfare of his people and the greater good of Islam. His life was dedicated to the service of Allah and the defense of Islamic lands, and he was regarded as a ruler who put the needs of his subjects before his own desires. His integrity and ability to inspire loyalty among his soldiers and subjects made him a beloved leader and a paragon of virtue. In the years following his death, Saladin's legacy became a source of inspiration for future Muslim rulers. Leaders such as Al-Kamil and Al-Adil, who succeeded him, sought to emulate his example of righteous leadership. Even though his empire had fragmented, his ideals lived on, and his name was invoked by rulers across the Muslim world as a reminder of what could be achieved through unity. Even in the face of political challenges, the memory of Saladin's leadership continued to influence both Muslim military strategy and diplomacy. His example of strategic patience and his commitment to negotiation, seen in his willingness to make peace with the Crusaders when it was necessary, would be reflected in future conflicts. His ability to adapt to changing circumstances and his long-term vision for the Muslim world made him a model for future generations of leaders who sought to balance military action with diplomacy. Saladin's influence, both as a military leader and as a statesman, was felt long after his death. His legacy remained a beacon for those who sought to unite the Muslim world, defend Islam against external threats, and restore Jerusalem as a symbol of Muslim strength and unity. Even as the Ayyubid Empire weakened and fragmented, Saladin's name continued to echo in the hearts and minds of those who sought to emulate his leadership and virtue. Saladin's legacy transcended the political and military realms. His impact on both the Muslim world and the Western world was profound, shaping not only the course of history, but also the narratives that would be passed down through generations. His reputation as a just and honorable leader continued to resonate, making him a subject of admiration, especially in the centuries that followed his death. In the Muslim world, Saladin became a symbol of chivalry, mercy, and military genius. His leadership during the Crusades and his victory in Jerusalem solidified his place in Islamic history. While his successors struggled to maintain the unity of the Ayyubid dynasty, Saladin's name continued to inspire future generations of Muslim rulers and military leaders. He was celebrated not only for his ability to reclaim Jerusalem, but for his commitment to religious tolerance, treating Christians and Jews fairly in the cities he controlled, including Jerusalem, where he allowed Christian pilgrims to visit the sacred sites. His administrative reforms, which helped improve the efficiency of the Ayyubid Empire, also contributed to his enduring legacy. Saladin's approach to governance, characterized by fairness and a commitment to justice, was often cited by later rulers as a model for leadership. His dedication to the public welfare, such as the building of roads, infrastructure, and the promotion of trade, ensured that his influence was not just felt on the battlefield, but also in the daily lives of the people he ruled. In addition to his leadership qualities, Saladin's personal character was a key part of his enduring legacy. His humility, devotion to Islam, and concern for the well-being of his subjects made him a revered figure not only in his own time, but in the centuries that followed. He was widely respected for his honor and integrity, qualities that were at the core of his leadership and his actions. Saladin became a symbol of the ideal Muslim ruler, someone who sought to combine military prowess with compassion and wisdom. However, Saladin's legacy was not confined to the Muslim world. In the Western world, particularly in Europe, Saladin was seen through a more complex lens. To the Crusaders and their supporters, he was an enemy, a formidable adversary who had retaken Jerusalem from Christian hands. But even among his enemies, Saladin earned admiration for his honor and fairness. His chivalric qualities and his magnanimity in victory earned him the respect of the Crusader leaders, including Richard the Lionheart, who, despite their rivalry, acknowledged Saladin's greatness. In European accounts, Saladin was often portrayed as the epitome of the noble Muslim ruler, a figure who adhered to the ideals of chivalry, a contrast to the brutality often attributed to other leaders of the time. His reputation was bolstered by the accounts of the Crusaders, who, in their own narratives, praised his noble conduct, his sense of justice, and his ability to balance religious devotion with the realpolitik of his empire. Even in the medieval Christian chronicles, Saladin was often presented as a dignified, almost mythic figure. Saladin's legacy also had cultural ramifications. The stories of his victories and his humane treatment of captives became a central part of the medieval epic tradition, influencing literature and poetry across both the Islamic world and the Christian West. He was celebrated in Persian and Arabic literature, where he was depicted as a hero who had saved the Muslim world in Jerusalem. In the West, the tales of Saladin's nobility and chivalry were woven into the romanticized accounts of the Crusades, where he was often portrayed as a counterpart to the Crusader knights, embodying the noble qualities of leadership. Even after his death, Saladin continued to influence political thought and the concept of leadership in both the Muslim and Christian worlds. His example was used by later Muslim rulers who sought to emulate his piety, military acumen, and ability to unite people under a common cause. In the Christian world, his name became synonymous with noble warfare, and his portrayal in literature and art solidified his status as a legendary figure who had transcended his historical moment. Saladin's legacy would continue to echo through the centuries. The reclamation of Jerusalem would remain a central theme for both the Muslim world and the Crusader states, and his figure would continue to serve as a symbol of resilience, honor, and sacrifice. Saladin's efforts to protect the Holy Land, his leadership in the face of adversity, and his ability to balance military power with compassionate governance made him a figure whose legacy would inspire. After the death of Saladin in 1193, his legacy reverberated across the Islamic world, and his impact was felt long after his reign. The Ayyubid Empire was left in a state of fragility, as the division of territories among Saladin's sons and brothers created a fragmented political landscape. Yet, despite the instability that followed his death, Saladin's image as a hero of Islam remained unshaken. He had united the Muslim world against the Crusaders, regained Jerusalem, and had become a symbol of piety, honor, and military genius. In the years immediately following his death, Saladin's legacy continued to influence the Muslim rulers who succeeded him. His vision of a unified Islamic front was something many sought to replicate, even as the political landscape shifted. Saladin's ability to unite a diverse array of Muslim factions, from the Sunnis to the Shias, was seen as a testament to his leadership. His success in establishing a strong central government, despite the challenges of his empire, was lauded by his contemporaries and those who followed. However, after his passing, his successors struggled to maintain the unity that had been central to Saladin's rule. His son, Al-Aziz Uthman, inherited Egypt but was unable to hold the same influence, and upon his death, the situation became even more fragmented. While Al-Adil, Saladin's brother, managed to consolidate power in Damascus, he too faced internal struggles that prevented him from fully realizing Saladin's vision. The Ayyubid family would continue to rule in different regions, but the central authority that Saladin had established gradually weakened, and the empire fractured into smaller, often competing, domains. Despite these political challenges, Saladin's moral legacy remained a binding force in the Muslim world. His dedication to Islamic unity, justice, and religious tolerance became ideals that successive generations of Muslim rulers and military leaders aspired to emulate. Saladin's treatment of non-Muslims, particularly in Jerusalem, where he allowed Christian pilgrims access to holy sites and protected Jewish communities, became a model of fair governance. His personal devotion to Islam and his chivalric qualities continued to influence how future leaders understood their role as defenders of the faith. As Saladin's empire fragmented, his personal character remained an enduring source of inspiration for Muslims across the region. His combination of military skill, strategic patience, and humanity set a precedent for how a Muslim ruler should conduct himself both on the battlefield and in the service of his people. Even in regions where his immediate family did not maintain power, Saladin's name became synonymous with honor and piety, and he was increasingly celebrated in Islamic literature and poetry. In the years after his death, Saladin's impact on Islamic governance continued to be studied by rulers and scholars. His administrative reforms in Egypt and Syria, his emphasis on justice, and his military tactics were all examined as examples of effective leadership. Saladin's rise to power, from a relatively humble position to becoming the ruler of one of the largest empires in the Muslim world, was considered a model of meritocratic leadership, where ability, integrity, and devotion to the faith were the key factors in attaining high office. His death in 1193 did not mark the end of his influence. Rather, it ensured that his spiritual and military legacy would continue to shape the Muslim world for centuries to come. His name would live on not just as a ruler, but as a symbol of what a Muslim leader could achieve, even in the face of overwhelming odds. As the Ayyubid Empire splintered, Saladin's example would serve as both a guiding light and a benchmark for future generations of Muslim leaders. Saladin's death in 1193 marked the end of an era, but his legacy as a military leader, a unifier, and a man of integrity continued to influence the Muslim world long after his passing. Though his empire fractured into several competing factions, the values and principles he embodied served as a guiding light for the next generation of rulers. His influence was particularly evident in the way subsequent Muslim leaders sought to emulate his leadership style, focusing not only on military victories but on justice, fairness, and the welfare of their people. The Ayyubid dynasty fractured shortly after Saladin's death, with his sons and brothers ruling over various territories. Al-Adil, Saladin's brother, initially managed to secure power in Syria and Damascus, but even he could not fully replicate Saladin's unifying authority. However, Saladin's example still loomed large in his approach to governance. Al-Adil sought to consolidate the fragmented empire by using diplomacy, alliances, and military force when necessary, much like Saladin had done during his own reign. While Al-Adil had a significant influence, Saladin's sons and nephews continued to look up to their father's legacy as a model of leadership. Al-Kamil, Saladin's son, succeeded in Egypt and tried to carry on his father's policies, especially the policy of mercy and tolerance toward non-Muslims. Al-Kamil's reign saw attempts to balance the internal divisions within the Ayyubid Empire, while also maintaining strong defensive policies against the Crusaders. Though he did not achieve the same level of unity as Saladin, Al-Kamil's commitment to defending Jerusalem and other holy sites showed that Saladin's ideals still resonated with the ruling elite. In fact, Saladin's influence extended far beyond the Ayyubid family. Even rival Muslim dynasties across the Middle East found inspiration in his leadership. The Mamluks, who would later rise to power in Egypt, were heavily influenced by Saladin's model of leadership. When they eventually took over Egypt in the 13th century, the Mamluks adopted many of his military strategies and administrative reforms. They would often invoke Saladin's name in political discourse, portraying themselves as his rightful successors and continuers of his mission to protect Islam from external invaders, especially the Crusaders. Saladin's religious commitment also became a major aspect of his legacy for future Muslim rulers. He was not just a military commander. He was a devout Muslim who upheld Islamic values and ensured that his empire was ruled according to Sharia law. His ability to balance military strategy with religious devotion made him an ideal figure for rulers who wished to demonstrate both their worldly power and spiritual legitimacy. Leaders like Baybars, a prominent Mamluk sultan, viewed Saladin as a model of piety and military prowess, and they too sought to protect the Islamic world from external threats while ensuring justice and order within their territories. Saladin's reputation for chivalry, both in battle and in diplomacy, continued to influence Muslim leaders throughout history. His reputation as a merciful conqueror, especially in his treatment of prisoners and his willingness to negotiate with his enemies, set a precedent for how future Muslim leaders should conduct themselves, both on and off the battlefield. His example of honor and restraint in the face of conflict became a standard to which rulers aspired, and it played a significant role in shaping the Islamic concept of leadership in subsequent centuries. Even outside the political and military sphere, Saladin's influence extended to Islamic scholarship. Historians, poets, and philosophers who lived after his death often regarded Saladin as a figure of ideal leadership. His story was recounted in many historical narratives and literary works, where he was portrayed not only as a military genius, but as a man of virtue. These portrayals ensured that Saladin's values, particularly his justice, mercy, and integrity, continued to shape the moral and political discourse in the Islamic world for centuries. Through these various avenues, Saladin's legacy became deeply embedded in the consciousness of the Muslim world. His influence transcended his time, making him a timeless symbol of Islamic resilience and the enduring quest to protect Islamic lands and holy sites. In the years that followed, his name would continue to inspire Muslim leaders, warriors, and common people alike, reminding them of the possibilities that could be achieved through unity, strength, and honor. Saladin's legacy, though rooted deeply in the Muslim world, reached far beyond the territories he governed, particularly impacting the Christian West. While the Crusades created bitter animosities between Christendom and the Islamic world, Saladin's reputation as a chivalrous and honorable leader earned him a degree of admiration, even among his Christian enemies. The Third Crusade, in which he famously clashed with Richard the Lionheart, solidified his image in the Western imagination as one of the most noble adversaries in history. In the years following Saladin's death, the Western world began to view him less as a ruthless conqueror and more as a figure of virtue and honor. Saladin's magnanimity, particularly in his treatment of prisoners of war and his respect for the Christian religious sites in Jerusalem, stood in stark contrast to the reputation of other military leaders of the time. His mercy toward captured Crusaders, his respect for the Christian faith, and his fairness in battle set him apart from many other figures in medieval warfare. One of the most striking examples of Saladin's influence in the Western world came through the portrayal of his character in European literature and historical accounts. Chroniclers from the Crusades, such as the famous Jean de Joinville, wrote about Saladin with a sense of admiration. Joinville, a French nobleman and chronicler, describes Saladin as a man who embodied the virtues of chivalry, something that resonated deeply with European knights and warriors. He was seen not only as a military genius, but as a man of honor, who adhered to the codes of knighthood in a way that even some crusaders found admirable. The Christian narrative of Saladin continued to evolve, especially in the medieval romances that recounted the events of the Crusades. Writers began to romanticize his figure, often portraying him as the perfect chivalric knight. In these accounts, Saladin was depicted as a noble leader who fought for justice and religion, but also showed compassion for his enemies. These stories were passed down through generations and became an important part of the medieval literary tradition, influencing how Europeans viewed not only Saladin, but also the broader Muslim world. Saladin's legacy as a man of honor also influenced the development of Christian-Muslim relations in the centuries that followed. His actions during the Crusades, such as allowing Christian pilgrims to visit Jerusalem and treating prisoners with dignity, serve as a model of how to manage conflicts and cultural differences with respect. In the centuries after his death, Saladin became a symbol of the possibility of coexistence between Christianity and Islam. His example was invoked by many who sought to build bridges between the two worlds, emphasizing the shared values of honor, mercy, and faith. In the modern era, Saladin's influence continued to grow in the West. His role as a symbol of resistance and heroic leadership was embraced by both Muslim leaders and secular figures. As the West sought to understand the complexities of Islam and the Middle East, Saladin became a symbol of the noble Islamic warrior. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as Western powers engaged with the Middle East, Saladin was frequently invoked in political and literary works, representing the ideal of a man who stood firm in the face of invaders and preserved. His legacy also found a place in Western education, where he was often studied as a figure of military strategy and leadership. Even today, historians and political analysts in the West look to Saladin's military campaigns, particularly his recapture of Jerusalem, as a model of strategic patience and leadership. His ability to combine diplomacy with military action, his emphasis on unity, and his commitment to justice are qualities that continue to be studied and admired in Western scholarly circles. Saladin's impact on Western culture extends beyond the battlefield and the pages of history. His legacy has been depicted in modern films, novels, and documentaries, where he is often portrayed as the noble adversary, the warrior king who inspired respect even in those who fought against him. From the medieval tales of his chivalry to modern interpretations of his leadership, Saladin's influence has transcended religious and cultural divides, cementing his place in the collective imagination of both the Muslim and Western worlds. In the modern era, Saladin's legacy has evolved into a symbol of resistance, unity, and Islamic pride, particularly in the Middle East. While Saladin's historical achievements were remarkable, his symbolic significance has only grown in the centuries following his death. His life and actions continue to inspire political movements, art, and literature, where he is often portrayed as a figure who fought not only for Islamic lands, but for the values of justice, honor, and leadership that transcend his time. Saladin's symbolism is deeply rooted in the concept of Islamic unity and the defense of Muslim identity. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, as the Middle East experienced the rise of nationalism, colonialism, and the struggle for independence, Saladin was increasingly invoked as a unifying figure. His efforts to unite the fragmented Muslim world against the Crusaders became a powerful model for those seeking to resist external domination and internal divisions. He was seen as a patriot who not only fought to defend his faith, but also sought to protect the honor of his people. In the modern Middle East, Saladin became a potent symbol during times of national conflict and anti-colonial movements. As the Ottoman Empire began to crumble in the early 20th century and new nation-states emerged in the region, Saladin's image was invoked by leaders who sought to unite their people against foreign powers. His leadership, marked by his ability to overcome division and forge alliances among diverse Muslim factions, was used as an ideal to promote national unity. Leaders such as Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt and Hafez al-Assad of Syria employed Saladin's name and legacy as a rallying cry for Arab nationalism and resistance to foreign intervention. In contemporary times, Saladin is often cited by Arab leaders and Islamic movements as a symbol of resistance to Western influence and Israel's presence in the region. His defense of Jerusalem remains an enduring symbol of the Muslim struggle for control over the city, which continues to hold immense religious and political significance. Saladin's story, particularly his recapture of Jerusalem in 1187, serves as a moral touchstone for those advocating for the return of Palestine to Arab hands. In this context, Saladin is more than just a historical figure. He is the embodiment of the Muslim world's aspirations for justice and the restoration of sovereignty. Saladin's symbolic power also extends to art and popular culture. His image has been immortalized in countless paintings, statues, and monuments across the Islamic world. His portrayal in film, literature, and television continues to capture the imagination of both Muslims and non-Muslims. In Arab cinema, Saladin has been depicted as a heroic figure who stood up to the Crusaders and upheld Islamic values. His character has also appeared in Western films and historical dramas, where he is often portrayed as the noble adversary, a model of honor and chivalry in contrast to the brutality of his enemies. In the literary world, Saladin's story has been retold in numerous works, from epic poetry to historical novels. His campaigns, particularly the Siege of Jerusalem, continue to captivate writers who draw upon his courage and strategic brilliance to create narratives of leadership and moral fortitude. The Crusades, and especially the figure of Saladin, are now the subjects of scholarship that examines the interactions between East and West during the medieval period, adding depth to the ongoing discussion of cross-cultural exchange and conflict. In the West, Saladin's portrayal has also evolved, especially in the context of modern historical scholarship and interfaith dialogue. Western historians have come to appreciate his diplomatic skills, his respect for religious pluralism, and his ability to balance military action with humanitarian concerns. He has been portrayed as a model ruler, someone who adhered to a code of honor that was admired even by his Crusader foes. In this way, Saladin has transcended the historical divide between Christianity and Islam, emerging as a figure who represents shared values of leadership and respect. Saladin's legacy is not confined to the past, but remains a living force in the Middle East and beyond. His vision of unity, justice, and resistance to oppression continues to resonate in the contemporary political and cultural landscape. Whether through national movements, art, or literature, Saladin remains a timeless figure, an enduring symbol of the Muslim world's resilience, honor, and uncompromising commitment to justice. Saladin's legacy continues to play a significant role not only in the Muslim world, but also in global political discourse and interfaith dialogue. As the Middle East faces ongoing conflicts, particularly regarding Palestine and the status of Jerusalem, Saladin's legacy as the defender of Jerusalem remains an important point of reference for both Muslim and Christian communities. His memory serves as a symbol of resistance against foreign occupation and an embodiment of the principles that guide those who seek justice, peace, and sovereignty in the region. In the political sphere, Saladin has become a symbol for movements that challenge external dominance, particularly in the context of the Arab-Israeli conflict. His reclaiming of Jerusalem in 1187 is often invoked by Palestinian leaders and other Arab political figures who view him as the ultimate example of a leader who fought for the liberation of Jerusalem and Muslim lands. His victory over the Crusaders has become an enduring symbol of resilience, and his actions continue to inspire those who seek to reclaim Jerusalem as the spiritual and political center of the Arab world. Saladin's legacy is also central to Islamic unity, particularly in Palestinian and broader Arab nationalism. His ability to unite a fractured Muslim world and forge alliances across sectarian lines has made him an enduring symbol of what is possible when diverse groups come together for a common cause. In the 20th and 21st centuries, his example has been used to call for unity among Arab nations and Muslim communities, particularly as they face challenges from external forces. Pan-Arab leaders like Nasser and Assad used Saladin's image to rally their people around the ideals of nationalism, sovereignty, and solidarity. But Saladin's influence isn't confined solely to Islamic politics. He has also become an important figure in interfaith dialogue, particularly between Muslims and Christians. His treatment of Christian pilgrims and his respectful interactions with Christian leaders have been frequently cited as a model of how religious tolerance can be maintained even in times of conflict. Unlike many of the Crusader leaders, who often resorted to violent rhetoric and actions, Saladin's willingness to allow Christian access to the holy sites of Jerusalem and to treat prisoners with mercy is seen by many as a lesson in coexistence and respect for religious diversity. Saladin's reputation as a man of honor and chivalry also contributes to his role in interfaith discussions. Christian scholars and clergy, especially in modern times, have examined his conduct as a contrast to the brutality often attributed to other medieval rulers. His generosity and sense of justice provide a unique perspective on medieval Islamic-Christian relations that is often overlooked in popular historical narratives. Through this lens, Saladin is viewed as not only a defender of Islam, but as a noble and virtuous figure in Christian history, showing that Christian-Muslim relations need not be defined by hostility, but can be framed by mutual respect and shared moral values. In contemporary political and cultural discussions, Saladin is invoked by moderate Islamic leaders who advocate for peaceful coexistence and dialogue between Muslims and Christians. His ability to balance military strength with compassion and diplomacy offers a model for resolving modern conflicts in the Middle East. Saladin's image has been used by peace advocates to argue for the importance of negotiation and cooperation in resolving disputes, particularly those surrounding Jerusalem and Palestine. He represents the possibility of finding common ground in a region long marred by division and conflict. Moreover, Saladin's role as a symbol in interfaith dialogue extends to scholarly discussions in the West. Many Western historians and scholars have increasingly sought to reframe the narrative of the Crusades by focusing on Saladin's more noble qualities, which contrasts with the often violent depictions of his adversaries. This process of reinterpreting history has allowed for a more balanced understanding of Saladin's importance, emphasizing not only his military achievements, but also his ethical approach to leadership. As the Muslim world continues to grapple with modern challenges, including political unrest and economic instability, Saladin's legacy remains a powerful touchstone. His ability to face overwhelming odds and emerge victorious, not only militarily, but also in his ethical conduct, continues to inspire political and spiritual leaders who strive to lead with integrity. In a region where the struggle for control over Jerusalem and holy sites remains a central issue, Saladin's legacy as the reclaimer of Jerusalem is as relevant as ever. His example of leadership, marked by honor, wisdom, and tolerance, continues to guide those who seek justice and peace in the Middle East and beyond. Saladin's legacy, especially in the modern era, extends far beyond the political and military realms. His name has become synonymous with justice, honor, and the restoration of Islamic dignity. In the contemporary world, particularly in the context of Palestine and the broader Arab world, Saladin is revered not only as a historical figure, but as a symbol of resistance and reclaiming identity. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Saladin's image has been co-opted by various political movements, particularly in the Arab-Israeli conflict, where his recapture of Jerusalem from the Crusaders in 1187 is viewed as a model for the return of Jerusalem to Arab hands. His role as the defender of Jerusalem has inspired Palestinian leaders and activists who seek to restore Palestinian sovereignty over the city. Saladin's reputation as a noble conqueror, who treated Christian pilgrims and Jews with respect during his rule, has made him a figure that transcends religious boundaries and continues to serve as a symbol of justice in the ongoing struggle for Palestinian rights. During the mid-20th century, Arab nationalist movements invoked Saladin's name as they sought to liberate Palestine for what they viewed as foreign domination. His victory over the Crusaders became a rallying cry for Arab unity and sovereignty, symbolizing the ability of the Arab world to resist external forces and reclaim their lands. Leaders like Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt often cited Saladin as an ideal figure of leadership, someone who combined military brilliance with moral integrity and a commitment to the defense of Muslim lands. Saladin's legacy also resonates deeply with the Palestinian people. The figure of Saladin has become not just a historical hero, but a symbol of hope and resilience. Palestinian militants and leaders have invoked Saladin's name to inspire future generations to fight for the liberation of Jerusalem and to resist occupation. His image has been prominently featured in Palestinian propaganda, art, and literature, where he is portrayed as a model of strategic brilliance and ethical leadership. In this context, Saladin is more than just a military leader. He is an icon of freedom and dignity, offering a model for the current struggle against foreign control. Saladin's enduring cultural significance also extends to Arab identity. In the face of Westernization and the global spread of Western ideals, Saladin has become a symbol of pride and resilience for many Arabs who seek to reassert their cultural identity. In a region that has long been influenced by colonialism and foreign intervention, Saladin represents a figure who successfully resisted outside forces and maintained his faith and values. His example provides a counter-narrative to the colonial legacy and continues to resonate with those who wish to reclaim their cultural heritage and sovereignty. In modern popular culture, Saladin continues to inspire as a figure of honor and virtue. His depictions in literature, films, and artworks continue to portray him as a noble leader, a man of integrity who is committed to the welfare of his people. Saladin's role in the Crusades has been explored in countless historical novels and films, where he is often portrayed as a wise and compassionate leader. His interactions with Richard the Lionheart have been romanticized in stories of chivalry, where the two adversaries are shown as honorable foes respecting each other's abilities. This portrayal of Saladin as a just ruler transcends religious boundaries, influencing both Muslim and non-Muslim audiences. While his political empire eventually fragmented after his death, Saladin's impact on Muslim governance and leadership has remained enduring. His principles of unity, justice, and mercy continue to influence political thought in the Islamic world. His reign is often used as a benchmark for measuring the effectiveness of modern Muslim leaders, and his example is cited by those who seek to navigate the challenges of governing in a complex and fragmented world. In the global context, Saladin's legacy is a reminder of the enduring power of leadership rooted in ethics and the importance of unity in the face of external threats. His story has transcended time and borders, continuing to inspire not just those in the Middle East, but also global leaders, scholars, and activists who seek to balance military strength with moral integrity.